Are you searching for the best in online black radio? Then go to blacktalkradionetwork.com, helping you filter through the noise. Real talk, black talk.
Context of White Supremacy. Context of White Supremacy. Justice Gus T Renegade in for another broadcast, hopefully to share constructive information on the system of white supremacy. Today's date is Friday, January 18th, 2012, so I have been told. We will be back tomorrow. Compensatory call-in. Lots of things happening all over the planet this week. Folks have sent in some good sound clips. If you find something noteworthy that you think should be shared, feel free. You can shoot me an email. Please do not sign me up for any email lists or any other craziness. Just, if you have a suggestion, news article you want me to check out, potential guest, that's fine. If you get confused about a program, that's fine. I just don't want to be signed up for any mailing lists, any other foolishness. My email is untiljustice@gmail.com. untiljustice@gmail.com. Folks also send things via Facebook. That's fine as well. My Facebook is facebook.com/the problem is white people. You can check that out as well. Invest if you think the program is constructive. You can submit any investments. My blog, racism-notes.blogspot.com. racism-notes.blogspot.com. My PayPal is in the top right of the page. Listener supported. Folks who contribute, that is how we are able to remain on the air. Also, we still have some t-shirts left. The only sizes we have remaining are XXX through medium. We don't have any smalls left. We don't have any XXXs left. So 2X through medium. That will work for you. We have some of those left. If you would like a shirt, they are $20. Just submit the funds via PayPal. Make sure you leave a note saying that you want a shirt specifically, and your mailing address and the size. Need that information to expedite things so we can get it rolling. But if you would like one of the counter-racist experiment t-shirts, please respect me like I am a white person. Have a few of those left as well. Right on. Oh, and Dr. Rasayan, folks that asked about that, Dr. Rasayan will be with us this Sunday evening, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. He will be back. He wanted to share some of his thoughts around the shootings that have been taking place, what happened at Sandy Hook, the firefighter in New York. Lots of these incidents, some similarities between what happened with these incidents and what took place in Colorado this past summer. He was on with us. Last time he visited with us was in August, and we spent a good deal of time talking about what took place in Aurora, Colorado. So that'll be this Sunday. He also wanted to, or I requested that he share some of his thoughts around all of these projects focusing on Lincoln, the films and the PBS special, and the comparisons between Lincoln and President Obama. He said he would be willing to offer a few thoughts on that as well. So I think that'll be this Sunday evening, 8 p.m. Eastern, 5 p.m. Pacific. Always a pleasure to have Dr. Rasayan visit with us. Right on. Our concluding session on George Orwell's 1984. I hope it has been a constructive investment of folks' time and energy. I know people have been picking up and seeing. I know some people said when this whole session started, they said that they hadn't heard of this book, or they had heard of it, but they had not read it. And now that we're closing in on being finished, folks are seeing how frequently this book is referenced. I think particularly in this time with all of the chaos that is being perpetuated by racist man, racist woman, racist child, you are really hearing a lot of Orwell invoked on a constant basis by white people who are whining, frequently in my estimation lying about how they are being harmed and victimized somehow. They frequently invoke the terminology and phrases from 1984 specifically, and other Orwellian themes, but a lot of it comes directly from this book, 1984. So I hope people will be a bit more informed. They'll be paying attention to that and just recognizing the powerful influence that this book continues to have well over 50 years after its original publication. Before we hop into this week, Mr. Orwell, as I said, he wrote a lot of essays. One of our listeners, they went to, he has several, or there are several sites that have some of his different writings available online. And folks, I think we're just going and doing some research to find out more about him and to see more of the essays that he has penned. And one of our listeners, she suggested that we share a little bit from his essay, Why I Write. She thought it was pretty important, give some more insight with regards to why he wrote this material, what he put together. This one is a little longer as well. So I'm not going to read the full essay, but I will share a tidbit. You can check this out online. The website that I've been using, and there are many, but I've just been going to this one because it's easy, is Orwell.ru. Orwell.ru, and you can go there and it gives more information, biographical info, and then it also has an index to show many of the articles that he wrote, and you can just view them from that website. But this one, Why I Write. Again, I'm not going to read the full article, but I'll read a little chunk of it, give you a flavor, and then we will get to the final audio segments for 1984. So this is from Why I Write. From a very early age, perhaps the age of 5 or 6, I knew that when I grew up, I should be a writer. Between the ages of about 17 and 24, I tried to abandon this idea, but I did so with the consciousness that I was outraging my true nature and that sooner or later I should have to settle down and write books. I was the middle child of 3. But there was a gap of 5 years on either side, and I barely saw my father before I was 8. For this and other reasons, I was somewhat lonely, and I soon developed disagreeable mannerisms which made me unpopular throughout my school days. I had the lonely child's habit of making up stories and holding conversations with imaginary persons, and I think from the very start of my literary ambitions were mixed up with the feeling of being isolated and undervalued. I knew that I had a facility with words and a power of facing unpleasant facts, and I felt that this created a sort of private world in which I could get my own back for my failure in everyday life. Nevertheless, the volume of serious, i.e., seriously intended writing which I produced all through my childhood and boyhood would not amount to a half a dozen pages. I wrote my first poem at the age of 4 or 5, my mother taking it down to dictation. I cannot remember anything about it except that it was about a tiger, and the tiger had chair-like teeth. A good enough phrase, but I fancy the poem was a plagiarism of Blake's Tiger. At 11, when the war, or 1914 through 18, broke out, I wrote a patriotic poem which was printed in the local newspaper, as was another 2 years later on the death of Kitchener. From time to time, when I was a bit older, I wrote bad and usually unfinished nature poems in the Georgian style. I also attempted a short story which was a ghastly failure. That was the total of the would-be serious work that I actually set down on paper during all those years. However, throughout this time, I did, in a sense, engage in literary activities. To begin with, there was the made-to-order stuff which I produced quickly, easily, and without much pleasure to myself. Apart from schoolwork, I wrote verse d'occasion, semi-comic poems which I could turn out at what now seems to me astonishing speed. At 14, I wrote a whole rhyming play in imitation of Aristophanes in about a week, and helped to edit a school magazine, both printed and in manuscript. These magazines were the most pitiful burlesque stuff that you could imagine, and I took far less trouble with them than I now would with the cheapest journalism. But side by side with all this, for 15 years or more, I was carrying out a literary exercise of a quite different kind. This was the making up of a continuous story about myself, a sort of diary existing only in the mind. I believe this is a common habit of children and adolescents. As a very small child, I used to imagine that I was, say, Robin Hood, and picture myself as the hero of thrilling adventures. But quite soon, my story ceased to be narcissistic in a crude way and became more and more a mere description of what I was doing and the things I saw. For minutes at a time, this kind of thing would be running through my head. He pushed the door open and entered the room, a yellow beam of sunlight filtering through the muslin curtains, slanted onto the table where a matchbox, half open, lay beside the ink pot. With his right hand in his pocket, he moved across to the window. Down in the street, a tortoiseshell cat was chasing a dead leaf, etc., etc. This habit continued until I was about 25, right through my non-literary years. Although I had to search, and did search, for the right words, I seemed to be making this descriptive effort almost against my will, under a kind of compulsion from outside. The story must, I suppose, have reflected the styles of the various writers I admired at different ages, but so far as I remember, it always had the same meticulous descriptive quality. When I was about 16, I suddenly discovered the joy of mere words, i.e., the sounds and associations of words. The lines from Paradise Lost. So he with difficulty and labor hard moved on. With difficulty and labor he. Which do not now seem to me so very wonderful, sent shivers down my backbone, and the spelling of he with 2 E's was an added pleasure. As for the need to describe things, I knew all about it already. So it is clear what kind of books I wanted to write, insofar as I could be said to want to write books at that time. I wanted to write enormous, naturalistic novels with unhappy endings, full of detailed descriptions and arresting similes, and also full of purple passages in which words were used partly for the sake of their own sound. And in fact, my first completed novel, Burmese Days, Cowbell Ring, which I wrote when I was 30 but projected much earlier, is rather that kind of book. I give all this background information because I do not think one can assess a writer's motives without knowing something of his early development. His subject matter will be determined by the age he lives in. At least this is true in tumultuous, revolutionary ages like our own. But before he ever begins to write, he will have acquired an emotional attitude from which he will never completely escape. It is his job, no doubt, to discipline his temperament and avoid getting stuck at some immature stage in some perverse mood. But if he escapes from his early influences altogether, he will have killed his impulse to write. Putting aside the need to earn a living, I think there are 4 great motives for writing. at any rate for writing prose. They exist in different degrees in every writer, and in any one writer the proportions will vary from time to time, according to the atmosphere in which he is living. They are: number 1, sheer egoism. Desire to seem clever, to be talked about, to be remembered after death, to get your own back on the grown-ups who snubbed you in childhood, etc. It is humbug to pretend this is not a motive, and a strong one. Writers share this characteristic with scientists, artists, politicians, lawyers, soldiers, successful businessmen, in short, with the whole top crust of humanity. The great mass of human beings are not acutely selfish. After the age of about 30, they almost abandon the sense of being individuals at all and live chiefly for others, or are simply smothered under drudgery. But there is also the minority of gifted, willful people who are determined to live their own lives to the end, and writers belong in this class. Serious writers, I should say, are on the whole more vain and self-centered than journalists, though less interested in money. Number 2, aesthetic enthusiasm. Perception of beauty in the external world, or, on the other hand, in words and their right arrangement. Pleasure in the impact of one sound on another, in the firmness of good prose or the rhythm of a good story. Desire to share an experience which one feels is valuable and ought not to be missed. The aesthetic motive is very feeble in a lot of writers. But even a pamphleteer or writer of textbooks will have pet words and phrases which appeal to him or her for non-utilitarian reasons. Or he may feel strongly about typography, width of margins, etc. Above the level of a railway guide, no book is quite free from aesthetic considerations. Number 3, historical impulse. Desire to see things as they are, to find out true facts and store them up for the use of posterity. Number 4, political purpose. Using the word political in the widest possible sense. Desire to push the world in a certain direction, to alter other people's idea of the kind of society that they should strive after. Once again, no book is genuinely free from political bias. The opinion that art should have nothing to do with politics is itself a political attitude. It can be seen how these various impulses must war against one another, and how they must fluctuate from person to person and from time to time. By nature, taking your nature to be the state you have attained when you are first adult, I am a person in whom the first 3 motives would outweigh the 4th. In a peaceful age, I might have written ornate or merely descriptive books, and might have remained almost unaware of my political loyalties. As it is, I have been forced into becoming a sort of pamphleteer. First, I spent 5 years in an unsuitable profession, the Indian Imperial Police in Burma. And then I underwent poverty and the sense of failure. This increased my natural hatred of authority and made me for the first time fully aware of the existence of the working classes, and the job in Burma had given me some understanding of the nature of imperialism. But these experiences were not enough to give me an accurate political orientation. Then came Hitler, the Spanish Civil War, etc. By the end of 1935, I had still failed to reach a firm decision. He goes on a little bit. This is, if I had to guess, a little more than half. He goes on to give a poem that he thinks describes his situation then, and he goes on to talk a little bit more about what influenced him to write. He talks specifically about Animal Farm and some of the other things that he wrote and things that influenced him. You can check that out. Again, this is authored in 1946. The essay is titled Why I Write. The beginning of it, when he talks about him being lonely and how he, I guess, was not bothered by talking about serious things and things that might have disappointed or upset certain folks, that he didn't really have a problem with that. That reminded me of curmudgeon. At any rate, we will get to the concluding segments for 1984. Last two segments. Definitely pay attention to the color schemes. Now, it will pop up more so in the second audio clip, but keep an eye out for color. This is like my last final announcement. Underline, highlighter, pay attention to the color schemes. Woof. Pay attention to the color schemes. How he uses color, it's going to be super explicit. Can't miss it. We will be back. I'll give out the phone number and all that jazz once we finish with the first segment. George Orwell, 1984, Context of White Supremacy.
Chapter 4. He was much better. He was growing fatter and stronger every day, if it was proper to speak of days. The white light and the humming sound were the same as ever, but the cell was a little more comfortable than the others he had been in. There were a pillow and a mattress on the plank bed and a stool to sit on. They had given him a bath, and they allowed him to wash himself fairly frequently in a tin basin. They even gave him warm water to wash with. They had given him new underclothes and a clean suit of overalls. They had dressed his varicose ulcer with soothing ointment. They had pulled out the remnants of his teeth and given him a new set of dentures. Weeks or months must have passed. It would have been possible now to keep count of the passage of time, if he had felt any interest in doing so, since he was being fed at what appeared to be regular intervals. He was getting, he judged, 3 meals in the 24 hours. Sometimes he wondered dimly whether he was getting them by night or by day. The food was surprisingly good, with meat at every third meal. Once there was even a packet of cigarettes. He had no matches, but the never-speaking guard who brought his food would give him a light. The first time he tried to smoke, it made him sick, but he persevered and spun the packet out for a long time, smoking half a cigarette after each meal. They had given him a white slate with a stump of pencil tied to the corner. At first he made no use of it. Even when he was awake, he was completely torpid. Often he would lie from one meal to the next almost without stirring, sometimes asleep, sometimes waking into vague reveries in which it was too much trouble to open his eyes. He had long grown used to sleeping with a strong light on his face. It seemed to make no difference, except that one's dreams were more coherent. He dreamed a great deal all through this time, and they were always happy dreams. He was in the golden country, or he was sitting among enormous, glorious, sunlit ruins with his mother, with Julia, with O'Brien, not doing anything, merely sitting in the sun, talking of peaceful things. Such thoughts as he had when he was awake were mostly about his dreams. He seemed to have lost the power of intellectual effort now that the stimulus of pain had been removed. He was not bored. He had no desire for conversation or distraction. Merely to be alone, not to be beaten or questioned, to have enough to eat and to be clean all over, was completely satisfying. By degrees he came to spend less time in sleep, but he still felt no impulse to get off the bed. All he cared for was to lie quiet and feel the strength gathering in his body. He would finger himself here and there, trying to make sure that it was not an illusion, that his muscles were growing rounder and his skin tauter. Finally, it was established beyond a doubt that he was growing fatter. His thighs were now definitely thicker than his knees. After that, reluctantly at first, he began exercising himself regularly. In a little while he could walk 3 kilometers, measured by pacing the cell, and his bowed shoulders were growing straighter. He attempted more elaborate exercises and was astonished and humiliated to find what things he could not do. He could not move out of a walk. He could not hold his stool out at arm's length. He could not stand on one leg without falling over. He squatted down on his heels and found that with agonizing pains in thigh and calf he could just lift himself to a standing position. He lay flat on his belly and tried to lift his weight by his hands. It was hopeless. He could not raise himself a centimeter. But after a few more days, a few more meal times, even that feat was accomplished. A time came when he could do it 6 times running. He began to grow actually proud of his body and to cherish an intermittent belief that his face also was growing back to normal. Only when he chanced to put his hand on his bald scalp did he remember the seamed, ruined face that had looked back at him out of the mirror. His mind grew more active. He sat down on the plank bed, his back against the wall and the slate on his knees, and set to work deliberately at the task of re-educating himself. He had capitulated. That was agreed. In reality, as he saw now, he had been ready to capitulate long before he had taken the decision, from the moment when he was inside the Ministry of Love. And yes, even during those minutes when he and Julia had stood helpless while the iron voice from the telescreen told them what to do, he had grasped the frivolity, the shallowness of his attempt to set himself up against the power of the party. He knew now that for 7 years the thought police had watched him like a beetle under a magnifying glass. There was no physical act, no word spoken aloud that they had not noticed, no train of thought that they had not been able to infer. Even the speck of whitish dust on the cover of his diary they had carefully replaced. They had played soundtracks to him, shown him photographs. Some of them were photographs of Julia and himself. Yes, even he could not fight against the party any longer. Besides, the party was in the right. It must be so. How could the immortal collective brain be mistaken? By what external standard could you check its judgments? Sanity was statistical. It was merely a question of learning to think as they thought. Only the pencil felt thick and awkward in his fingers. He began to write down the thoughts that came into his head. He wrote first in large, clumsy capitals, "Freedom is slavery." Then, almost without a pause, he wrote beneath it, 2 and 2 make 5. But then there came a sort of check. His mind, as though shying away from something, seemed unable to concentrate. He knew that he knew what came next, but for the moment he could not recall it. When he did recall it, it was only by consciously reasoning out what it must be. It did not come of its own accord. He wrote, "God is power." He accepted everything. The past was alterable. The past never had been altered. Oceania was at war with East Asia. Oceania had always been at war with East Asia. Jones, Aronson, and Rutherford were guilty of the crimes they were charged with. He had never seen the photograph that disproved their guilt. It had never existed. He had invented it. He remembered remembering contrary things, but those were false memories, products of self-deception. How easy it all was. Only surrender, and everything else followed. It was like swimming against a current that swept you backwards, however hard you struggled, and then suddenly deciding to turn round and go with the current instead of opposing it. Nothing had changed except your own attitude. The predestined thing happened in any case. He hardly knew why he had ever rebelled. Everything was easy except anything could be true. The so-called laws of nature were nonsense. The law of gravity was nonsense. If I wished, O'Brien had said, I could float off this floor like a soap bubble. Winston worked it out. If he thinks, he floats off the floor, and if I simultaneously think I see him do it, then the thing happens. Suddenly, like a lump of submerged wreckage breaking the surface of water, the thought burst into his mind, it doesn't really happen. We imagine it. It is hallucination. He pushed the thought under instantly. The fallacy was obvious. It presupposed that somewhere or other outside oneself there was a real world where real things happened. But how could there be such a world? What knowledge have we of anything save through our own minds? All happenings are in the mind. Whatever happens in all minds truly happens. He had no difficulty in disposing of the fallacy, and he was in no danger of succumbing to it. He realized nevertheless that it ought never to have occurred to him. The mind should develop a blind spot whenever a dangerous thought presented itself. The process should be automatic, instinctive. Crime Stop, they call it in Newspeak. He set to work to exercise himself in Crime Stop. He presented himself with propositions. The party says the earth is flat. The party says that ice is heavier than water, and trained himself in not seeing or not understanding the arguments that contradicted them. It was not easy. It needed great powers of reasoning and improvisation. The arithmetical problems raised, for instance, by such a statement as 2 and 2 make 5 were beyond his intellectual grasp. It needed also a sort of athleticism of mind, an ability at one moment to make the most delicate use of logic, and at the next to be unconscious of the crudest logical errors. Stupidity was as necessary as intelligence, and as difficult to attain. All the while, with one part of his mind, he wondered how soon they would shoot him. Everything depends on yourself, O'Brien had said, but he knew that there was no conscious act by which he could bring it nearer. It might be 10 minutes hence or 10 years. They might keep him for years in solitary confinement. They might send him to a labor camp. They might release him for a while, as they sometimes did. It was perfectly possible that before he was shot, the whole drama of his arrest and interrogation would be enacted all over again. The one certain thing was that death never came at an expected moment. The tradition, the unspoken tradition, somehow you knew it though you never heard it said, was that they shot you from behind, always in the back of the head, without warning as you walked down a corridor from cell to cell. One day was not the right expression. Just as probably it was in the middle of the night. Once he fell into a strange, blissful reverie. He was walking down the corridor waiting for the bullet. He knew that it was coming in another moment. Everything was settled, smoothed out, reconciled. There were no more doubts, no more arguments, no more pain, no more fear. His body was healthy and strong. He walked easily, with a joy of movement and with a feeling of walking in sunlight. He was not any longer in the narrow white corridors of the Ministry of Love. He was in the enormous sunlit passage, a kilometre wide, down which he had seemed to walk in the delirium induced by drugs. He was in the golden country, following the foot-track across the old rabbit-cropped pasture. He could feel the short, springy turf under his feet and the gentle sunshine on his face. At the edge of the field were the elm trees faintly stirring, and somewhere beyond that was the stream where the dace lay in the green pools under the willows. Suddenly he started up with a shock of horror. The sweat broke out on his backbone. He had heard himself cry aloud, "Julia! Julia! Julia, my love! Julia!" For a moment he had had an overwhelming hallucination of her presence. She had seemed to be not merely with him, but inside him. It was as though she had got into the texture of his skin. In that moment he had loved her far more than he had ever done when they were together and free. Also he knew that somewhere or other she was still alive and needed his help. He lay back on the bed and tried to compose himself. What had he done? How many years had he added to his servitude by that moment of weakness? In another moment he would hear the tramp of boots outside. They could not let such an outburst go unpunished. They would know now, if they had not known before, that he was breaking the agreement he had made with them. He obeyed the party, but he still hated the party. In the old days he had hidden a heretical mind beneath an appearance of conformity. Now he had retreated a step further. In the mind he had surrendered, but he had hoped to keep the inner heart inviolate. He knew that he was in the wrong, and he preferred to be in the wrong. They would understand that. O'Brien would understand it. It was all confessed in that single foolish cry. He would have to start all over again. It might take years. He ran a hand over his face, trying to familiarize himself with the new shape. There were deep furrows in the cheeks. The cheekbones felt sharp, the nose flattened. Besides, since last seeing himself in the glass, he had been given a complete new set of teeth. It was not easy to preserve inscrutability when you did not know what your face looked like. In any case, mere control of the features was not enough. For the first time he perceived that if you want to keep a secret, you must also hide it from yourself. You must know all the while that it is there, but until it is needed you must never let it emerge into your consciousness in any shape that could be given a name. From now on outwards he must not only think right, he must feel right, dream right. And all the while he must keep his hatred locked up inside him like a ball of matter which was part of himself and yet unconnected with the rest of him, a kind of cyst. One day they would decide to shoot him. You could not tell when it would happen, but a few seconds beforehand it should be possible to guess. It was always from behind, walking down a corridor. 10 seconds would be enough. In that time the world inside him could turn over, and then suddenly, without a word uttered, without a check in his step, without the changing of a line in his face, suddenly the camouflage would be down, and bang would go the batteries of his hatred. Hatred would fill him like an enormous roaring flame, and almost in the same instant, bang would go the bullet, too late or too early. It would have blown his brain to pieces before they could reclaim it. The heretical thought would be unpunished, unrepented, out of their reach forever. They would have blown a hole in their own perfection. To die hating them, that was freedom. He shut his eyes. It was more difficult than accepting an intellectual discipline. It was a question of degrading himself, mutilating himself. He had got to plunge into the filthiest of filth. What was the most horrible, sickening thing of all? He thought of Big Brother. The enormous face, because of constantly seeing it on posters, he always thought of it as being a meter wide, with its heavy black mustache, and the eyes that followed you to and fro seemed to float into his mind of its own accord. What were his true feelings toward Big Brother? There was a heavy tramp of boots in the passage. The steel door swung open with a clang. O'Brien walked into the cell. Behind him were the waxen-faced officer and the black-uniformed guards. "Get up," said O'Brien. "Come here." Winston stood opposite him. O'Brien took Winston's shoulders between his strong hands and looked at him closely. "You have had thoughts of deceiving me," he said. "That was stupid. Stand up straighter. Look me in the face." He paused and went on in a gentler tone. "You are improving. Intellectually, there is very little wrong with you. It is only emotionally that you have failed to make progress. Tell me, Winston. And remember no lies. You know that I am always able to detect a lie. Tell me, what are your true feelings toward Big Brother?" "I hate him." "You hate him. Good. Then the time has come for you to take the last step. You must love Big Brother. It is not enough to obey him. You must love him." He released Winston with a little push toward the guards. "Room 101, he said. Chapter 5. At each stage of his imprisonment he had known, or seemed to know, whereabouts he was in the windowless building. Possibly there were slight differences in the air pressure. The cells where the guards had beaten him were below ground level. The room where he had been interrogated by O'Brien was high up near the roof. This place was many meters underground, as deep down as it was possible to go. It was bigger than most of the cells he had been in, but he hardly noticed his surroundings. All he noticed was that there were two small tables straight in front of him, each covered with green baize. One was only a meter or two from him, the other was further away, near the door. He was strapped upright in a chair, so tightly that he could move nothing, not even his head. A sort of pad gripped his head from behind, forcing him to look straight in front of him. For a moment he was alone, then the door opened, and O'Brien came in. "You asked me once," said O'Brien, "what was in room 101. I told you that you knew the answer already. Everyone knows it. The thing that is in room 101 is the worst thing in the world." The door opened again. A guard came in carrying something made of wire, a box or basket of some kind. He set it down on the further table. Because of the position in which O'Brien was standing, Winston could not see what the thing was. "The worst thing in the world," said O'Brien, "varies from individual to individual. It may be burial alive, or death by fire, or by drowning, or by impalement, or 50 other deaths. There are cases where it is some quite trivial thing, not even fatal." He had moved a little to one side so that Winston had a better view of the thing on the table. It was an oblong wire cage, with a handle on top for carrying it by. Fixed to the front of it was something that looked like a fencing mask, with the concave side outwards. Although it was 3 or 4 meters away from him, he could see that the cage was divided lengthways into 2 compartments, and that there was some kind of creature in each. They were rats. "In your case," said O'Brien, "the worst thing in the world happens to be rats." A sort of premonitory tremor, a fear of he was not certain what, had passed through Winston as soon as he caught his first glimpse of the cage. But at this moment the meaning of the mask-like attachment in front of it suddenly sank into him. His bowels seemed to turn to water. "You can't do that!" he cried out in a high, cracked voice. You couldn't! It's impossible!" "Do you remember," said O'Brien, "the moment of panic that used to occur in your dreams? There was a wall of blackness in front of you, and a roaring sound in your ears. There was something terrible on the other side of the wall. You knew that you knew what it was, but you dared not drag it into the open. It was the rats that were on the other side of the wall." "O'Brien," said Winston, making an effort to control his voice, "you know this is not necessary. What is it that you want me to do?" O'Brien made no direct answer. When he spoke, it was in the schoolmasterish manner that he sometimes affected. He looked thoughtfully into the distance, as though he were addressing an audience somewhere behind Winston's back. "By itself," he said, "pain is not always enough. There are occasions when a human being will stand out against pain even to the point of death. But for everyone there is something unendurable, something that cannot be contemplated. Courage and cowardice are not involved. If you are falling from a height, it is not cowardly to clutch at a rope. If you have come up from deep water, it is not cowardly to fill your lungs with air. It is merely an instinct which cannot be disobeyed. It is the same with the rats. For you, they are unendurable. They are a form of pressure that you cannot withstand even if you wish to. You will do what is required of you." "But what is it? What is it? How can I do it if I don't know what it is?" O'Brien picked up the cage and brought it across to the nearer table. He set it down carefully on the baize cloth. Winston could hear the blood singing in his ears. He had the feeling of sitting in utter loneliness. He was in the middle of a great empty plain, a flat desert drenched with sunlight, across which all sounds came to him out of immense distances. Yet the cage with the rats was not 2 meters away from him. They were enormous rats. They were at the age when a rat's muzzle grows blunt and fierce, and his fur brown instead of grey. "The rat," said O'Brien, still addressing his invisible audience, "although a rodent, is carnivorous. You are aware of that. You will have heard of the things that happen in the poor quarters of this town. In some streets a woman dare not leave her baby alone in the house even for 5 minutes. The rats are certain to attack it. Within quite a small time they will strip it to the bones. They also attack sick or dying people. They show astonishing intelligence in knowing when a human being is helpless." There was an outburst of squeals from the cage. It seemed to reach Winston from far away. The rats were fighting. They were trying to get at each other through the partition. He heard also a deep groan of despair. That, too, seemed to come from outside himself. O'Brien picked up the cage and as he did so pressed something in it. There was a sharp click. Winston made a frantic effort to tear himself loose from the chair. It was hopeless. Every part of him, even his head, was held immovably. O'Brien moved the cage nearer. It was less than a meter from Winston's face. "I have pressed the first lever," said O'Brien. "You understand the construction of this cage. The mask will fit over your head, leaving no exit. When I press this other lever, the door of the cage will slide up. These starving brutes will shoot out of it like bullets. Have you ever seen a rat leap through the air? They will leap onto your face and bore straight into it. Sometimes they attack the eyes first. Sometimes they burrow through the cheeks and devour the tongue." The cage was nearer. It was closing in. Winston heard a succession of shrill cries which appeared to be occurring in the air above his head. But he fought furiously against his panic. To think even with a split second left, to think was the only hope. Suddenly the foul, musty odor of the brute struck his nostrils. There was a violent convulsion of nausea inside him, and he almost lost consciousness. Everything had gone black. For an instant he was insane, a screaming animal. Yet he came out of the blackness clutching an idea. There was one and only one way to save himself. He must interpose another human being, the body of another human being, between himself and the rats. The circle of the mask was large enough now to shut out the vision of anything else. The wire door was a couple of handspans from his face. The rats knew what was coming now. One of them was leaping up and down. The other, an old, scaly grandfather of the sewers, stood up with his pink hands against the bars and fiercely snuffed the air. Winston could see the whiskers and the yellow teeth. Again the black panic took hold of him. He was blind, helpless, mindless. "It was a common punishment in Imperial China," said O'Brien as didactically as ever. The mask was closing on his face. The wire brushed his cheek. And then, no, it was not relief, only hope, a tiny fragment of hope. Too late, perhaps too late, but he had suddenly understood that in the whole world there was just one person to whom he could transfer his punishment, one body that he could thrust between himself and the rats, and he was shouting frantically over and over, "Do it to Julia! Do it to Julia, not me! Julia! I don't care what you do to her! Tear her face off! Strip her to the bones! Not me! Julia, not me!" He was falling backwards into enormous depths away from the rats. He was still strapped in the chair, but he had fallen through the floor, through the walls of the building, through the earth, through the oceans, through the atmosphere, into outer space, into the gulfs between the stars, always away, away, away from the rats. He was light years distant, but O'Brien was still standing at his side. There was still the cold touch of a wire against his cheek, but through the darkness that enveloped him he heard another metallic click, and knew that the cage door had clicked shut and not open. Chapter 6. The chestnut tree was almost empty. A ray of sunlight slanting through a window fell yellow on dusty tabletops. It was the lonely hour of 15. A tinny music trickled from the telescreens. Winston sat in his usual corner, gazing into an empty glass. Now and again he glanced up at a vast face which eyed him from the opposite wall. "Big Brother is watching you," the caption said. Unbidden, a waiter came and filled his glass up with Victory gin, shaking into it a few drops from another bottle with a quill through the cork. It was saccharin flavored with cloves, the specialty of the cafe. Winston was listening to the telescreen. At present only music was coming out of it, but there was a possibility that at any moment there might be a special bulletin from the Ministry of Peace. The news from the African front was disquieting in the extreme. On and off he had been worrying about it all day. A Eurasian army, Oceania was at war with Eurasia, Oceania had always been at war with Eurasia, was moving southward at terrifying speed. The midday bulletin had not mentioned any definite area, but it was probable that already the mouth of the Congo was a battlefield. Brazzaville and Leopoldville were in danger. One did not have to look at the map to see what it meant. It was not merely a question of losing Central Africa. For the first time in the whole war, the territory of Oceania itself was menaced. A violent emotion, not fear exactly, but a sort of undifferentiated excitement flared up in him, then faded again. He stopped thinking about the war. In these days he could never fix his mind on any one subject for more than a few moments at a time. He picked up his glass and drained it at a gulp. As always, it made him shudder and even retch slightly. The stuff was horrible. The cloves and saccharin, themselves disgusting enough in their sickly way, could not disguise the flat, oily smell, and what was worst of all was that the smell of gin, which dwelt with him night and day, was inextricably mixed up in his mind with the smell of those— He never named them, even in his thoughts, and so far as it was possible he never visualized them. They were something that he was half aware of, hovering close to his face, a smell that clung to his nostrils. As the gin rose in him, he belched through purple lips. He had grown fatter since they released him, and had regained his old color. Indeed, more than regained it. His features had thickened. The skin on nose and cheekbones was coarsely red. Even the bald scalp was too deep a pink. A waiter, again unbidden, brought the chessboard and the current issue of the Times, with the page turned down at the chess problem. Then, seeing that Winston's glass was empty, he brought the gin bottle and filled it. There was no need to give orders. They knew his habits. The chessboard was always waiting for him, his corner table was always reserved. Even when the place was full, he had it to himself, since nobody cared to be seen sitting too close to him. He never even bothered to count his drinks. At irregular intervals they presented him with a dirty slip of paper which they said was the bill, but he had the impression that they always undercharged him. It would have made no difference if it had been the other way about. He had always plenty of money nowadays. He even had a job, a sinecure, more highly paid than his old job had been. The music from the telescreen stopped and a voice took over. Winston raised his head to listen. No bulletin from the front, however. It was merely a brief announcement from the Ministry of Plenty. In the preceding quarter, it appeared the 10th three-year plan's quota for bootlaces had been over-fulfilled by 98%. He examined the chess problem and set out the pieces. It was a tricky ending, involving a couple of knights. White to play and mate in 2 moves. Winston looked up at the portrait of Big Brother. White always mates, he thought with a sort of cloudy mysticism. Always, without exception, it is so arranged. In no chess problem since the beginning of the world has black ever won. Did it not symbolize the eternal, unvarying triumph of good over evil? The huge face gazed back at him, full of calm power. White always mates. The voice from the telescreen paused and added in a different and much graver tone, "You are warned to stand by for an important announcement at 15:30. 15:30. This is news of the highest importance. Take care not to miss it. 15:30. The tinkling music struck up again. Winston's heart stirred. That was the bulletin from the front. Instinct told him that it was bad news that was coming. All day, with little spurts of excitement, the thought of a smashing defeat in Africa had been in and out of his mind. He seemed actually to see the Eurasian army swarming across the never-broken frontier and pouring down into the tip of Africa like a column of ants. Why had it not been possible to outflank them in some way? The outline of the West African coast stood out vividly in his mind. He picked up the white knight and moved it across the board. There was the proper spot. Even while he saw the black horde racing southward, he saw another force, mysteriously assembled, suddenly planted in their rear, cutting their communications by land and sea. He felt that by willing it, he was bringing that other force into existence. But it was necessary to act quickly. If they could get control of the whole of Africa, if they had airfields and submarine bases at the Cape, it would cut Oceania in two. It might mean anything. Defeat, breakdown, the redivision of the world, the destruction of the party. He drew a deep breath. An extraordinary medley of feelings, but it was not a medley exactly, rather it was successive layers of feeling in which one could not say which layer was undermost, struggled inside him. The spasm passed. He put the white knight back in its place, but for the moment he could not settle down to a serious study of the chess problem. His thoughts wandered again. Almost unconsciously he traced with his finger in the dust on the table 2 + 2 = 5. "They can't get inside you," she had said. "But they could get inside you. What happens to you here is forever," O'Brien had said. That was a true word. There were things, your own acts, from which you could not recover. Something was killed in your breast, burnt out, cauterized out. He had seen her. He had even spoken to her. There was no danger in it. He knew it as though instinctively that they now took almost no interest in his doings. He could have arranged to meet her a second time if either of them had wanted to. Actually, it was by chance that they had met. It was in the park, on a vile, biting day in March, when the earth was like iron and all the grass seemed dead, and there was not a bud anywhere except a few crocuses which had pushed themselves up to be dismembered by the wind. He was hurrying along with frozen hands and watering eyes when he saw her not 10 meters away from him. It struck him at once that she had changed in some ill-defined way. They almost passed one another without a sign. Then he turned and followed her, not very eagerly. He knew that there was no danger, nobody would take any interest in them. She did not speak. She walked obliquely away across the grass as though trying to get rid of him, then seemed to resign herself to having him at her side. Presently they were in among a clump of ragged, leafless shrubs, useless either for concealment or as protection from the wind. They halted. It was vilely cold. The wind whistled through the twigs and fretted the occasional dirty-looking crocuses. He put his arm round her waist. There was no telescreen, but there must be hidden microphones. Besides, they could be seen. It did not matter. Nothing mattered. They could have lain down on the ground and done that, if they had wanted to. His flesh froze with horror at the thought of it. She made no response whatever to the clasp of his arm. She did not even try to disengage herself. He knew now what had changed in her. Her face was sallower, and there was a long scar, partly hidden by the hair, across her forehead and temple. But that was not the change. It was that her waist had grown thicker and in a surprising way had stiffened. He remembered how, once, after the explosion of a rocket bomb, he had helped to drag a corpse out of some ruins, and had been astonished not only by the incredible weight of the thing, but by its rigidity and awkwardness to handle, which made it seem more like stone than flesh. Her body felt like that. It occurred to him that the texture of her skin would be quite different from what it had once been. He did not attempt to kiss her, nor did they speak. As they walked back across the gate, she looked directly at him for the first time. It was only a momentary glance full of contempt and dislike. He wondered whether it was a dislike that came purely out of the past, or whether it was inspired also by his bloated face and the water that the wind kept squeezing from his eyes. They sat down on 2 iron chairs, side by side, but not too close together. He saw that she was about to speak. She moved her clumsy shoe a few centimeters and deliberately crushed a twig. Her feet seemed to have grown broader, he noticed. "I betrayed you," she said baldly. "I betrayed you," he said. She gave him another quick look of dislike. "Sometimes," she said, "they threaten you with something you can't stand up to, can't even think about. And then you say, 'Don't do it to me, do it to somebody else, do it to so-and-so.' And perhaps you might pretend afterwards that it was only a trick and that you just said it to make them stop and didn't really mean it. But that isn't true. At the time when it happens, you do mean it. You think there's no other way of saving yourself, and you're quite ready to save yourself that way. You want it to happen to the other person. You don't give a damn what they suffer. All you care about is yourself." "All you care about is yourself," he echoed. "And after that you don't feel the same toward the other person any longer." "No," he said. "You don't feel the same." There did not seem to be anything more to say. The wind plastered their thin overalls against their bodies. Almost at once it became embarrassing to sit there in silence. Besides, it was too cold to keep still. She said something about catching her tube and stood up to go. "We must meet again," he said. "Yes," she said. "We must meet again." He followed irresolutely for a little distance, half a pace behind her. They did not speak again. She did not actually try to shake him off, but walked at just such a speed as to prevent his keeping abreast of her. He had made up his mind that he would accompany her as far as the tube station, but suddenly this process of trailing along in the cold seemed pointless and unbearable. He was overwhelmed by a desire not so much to get away from Julia as to get back to the Chestnut Tree Cafe, which had never seemed so attractive as at this moment. He had a nostalgic vision of his corner table with the newspaper and the chessboard and the ever-flowing gin. Above all, it would be warm in there. The next moment, not altogether by accident, he allowed himself to become separated from her by a small knot of people. He made a half-hearted attempt to catch up, then slowed down, turned, and made off in the opposite direction. When he had gone 50 meters, he looked back. The street was not crowded, but already he could not distinguish her. Any one of a dozen hurrying figures might have been hers. Perhaps her thickened, stiffened body was no longer recognizable from behind. "At the time when it happens," she had said, "you do mean it." He had meant it. He had not merely said it, he had wished it. He had wished that she, and not he, should be delivered over to the... Something changed in the music that trickled from the telescreen. A cracked and jeering note, a yellow note, came into it. And then, perhaps it was not happening, perhaps it was only a memory taking on the semblance of sound. A voice was singing, "Under the spreading chestnut tree, I sold you and you sold me." The tears welled up in his eyes.
Context of White Supremacy. One more time. Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial is 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. Give out the number one more time. 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. One more audio clip left, or segment. from the book remaining, and we will be all done before I hit the phone lines. And this, I have been thinking of this pretty much every week. I don't know why I hadn't mentioned it before. One thing that has stood out to me, and this is just a general comment on audiobooks, they are grand for a lot of reasons. Sometimes if you are in a vehicle, or people who, travel, if you do go out walking, or if you're exercising or what have you, where you have your portable audio player, grand way to be able to access books that way, as opposed to having that quiet time. I know a lot of people out there do not have time to sit down and read, so it can be a great way to read material. But being in a situation where I'm able to listen to the audiobook and have the book in front of me, when you listen to someone read a book, it takes a lot more time. I've noted frequently in reading where I'm reading the book, just to make sure that they haven't switched any text around and that sort of thing. And you can read so much faster than someone actually reading aloud. I think that's the case for most people. So that's one thing that I have noted. It is a lot less efficient. I think for most people, you can read a lot faster silently to yourself than someone actually reading to you. So probably, I think I read 1984 in less than a week. It's taken us, even though we're only doing one section a week, it's taken us a lot more time with the audiobook. But that is not a commentary on this text or anything. That's just general observation. Alrighty, going to the phone lines. I will open up other lines as I see hands go up. So if you chime in, if you raise a hand, I'll open your line, and just make sure you keep the background noise to a minimum. Caller in now the Bronx, different borough, caller in the Bronx, your line should be open.
Greetings, Gus.
Good to hear from you, sir.
You as well, sir. First off, wow, very interesting indeed. The thing with the rats, for one thing, if you turn the word rats 180 degrees backwards, you have the word star. He could have said mice, but so that's one thing. I mean, there's a lot. So rats are like seen as vermin, like white people always have the quick fixes, and so it's like, oh, we can get rid of them, kill them, that's just like the solution is to kill. But rats are, they're not people, but they are, they do exist. They are, they have the right to life, so. But they call them vermin, and then it's like if you extrapolate that to, the context of white supremacy, we are seen as vermin on the planet. White people are the, cultural, kings and queens of the planet. They tell, they're like the parent people, they're the, they're like the parent culture right now in operation. They act like, they're better than everyone, and that's what makes them fit to rule. And they see us as vermin, so it's like, it kind of illustrates the pathology in this very coherent manner, if you can look behind if you can look a little bit deeper than than just the subject matter. Like you see that Winston is terrified of the most terrifying thing in the world to him is this totally irrational fear of rats. Not totally irrational, but for the most part, 99% irrational, And the descriptions that he gave about the rats being the worst thing in the world, he talked about the fur was brown instead of gray. He said that they show astonishing intelligence, and he just was in just despair, where he was hallucinating and about to throw up. He called them starving brutes. He said the starving brutes. He called them brutes a bunch of times. And then everything went black. He's like blacks out, so-called, so to speak. He said they had pink hands, the rats. He said something about the grandfather from he was talking about one of the rats. He called it the grandfather from the sewers. It's just like, oh my gosh. He said they had pink hands. I have pink hands. And then finally when he gives up Julia, I feel like that's like the Urugu thing, going back to his story about snatching the chocolate from his sister who is dying and needs food, and his mother's like trying to do everything for him all, she's trying to be a good mom in the face of this like sweeping like depression kind of thing, and like he snatches the chocolate and runs away. It's like he gives up Julia in the face of this irrational fear that he was being confronted with. And the whole time he knew that he was going to give up anyway. He wasn't really trying to fight the system or whatever. He was just kind of playing the hero. It's just Urugu, like, it just really pulls out that, and then when he falls and when he finally gives up Julia, which is like the only thing that really gives his life meaning, then all of a sudden, like, I've read a lot. I was just thinking that I think Neely Fuller's book that I read last year, I think that was the first book that I ever read that was written by a non-white person. And I've been reading since I was 3 years old. Like, I've read a ton of books. I don't think I've ever read any books by black people, which it's pretty crazy. Evidence of racism, white supremacy, working very well. But just the white people talking about these like kind of quasi-spiritual kind of like scenarios where they have this out-of-body experience and they're falling through the earth, and they whatever, astral projection and stuff, and just this part where he's falling through the earth and falling through the stars, and he's just going further and further away from the rats, which if you turn the word rats backwards into the word star, and it's like a delusion of this God kind of consciousness, this delusion of grandeur. So I said a lot, so I'll let it go for there for now. Let someone else speak.
Definitely. We have two other folks with us as well. See what they have to share also. I suspect that's probably true for a lot of non-white people, though, that they have not read very much material from black authors, a part of racist design. Let's see, we should have B More and 9325. Both of your lines should be open as well.
Peace, Gus, and all the other listeners. Well, I don't know, the whole idea of how physical pain affects the human mind, that's what really stuck out to me. It's like he didn't even necessarily put the rats on him, but it's just the whole idea of this physical harm. It's sort of like it overrided his logic or his reasoning. So that really stuck out to me. And then the whole idea of this room 101, the number 101 stuck out to me. I thought back to college, as far as, modern TV day shows or whatever. I don't watch a lot of TV, but I know they'll show English 101, and it's usually like an introductory class. So this whole idea of it being named Room 101, I was just thinking, of introductory class and how he's learning to basically be controlled, learning to be submissive, and basically breaking him down or whatever. So Room 101, the whole number 101 stuck out to me. And it also made me think, I played a sorority in college. This was before I came into consciousness. And when you go through a sorority and you so-called cross the burning sands and things like that, they say that they break you down to build you up. And they also use a bunch of mind control and things like that. They break your mind as well as, sometimes it does get physical and things like that. So I thought about the whole sorority idea as well as just my whole entire college experience. So that came to mind. And I thought it really stuck out as well. It ended under the spreading chestnut tree. I sold you and you sold me. That stuck out to me just while it played right at the time he was thinking that. So it's just like this whole mind control thing. And then something else that stuck out to me is this mention of Africa and the White Knight. I believe he was playing chess. So I don't know, in that instant I thought of quiet weapons for silent wars, and just how in playing chess you not only have to know your strategy, but you have to know the enemy's strategy. So I thought about that. And I thought about how both Winston and the woman, I forgot her name, Julia, I want to say, how they were broken, and they became a new person, not only mentally but also physically. I believe they talked about how they were bigger or thicker. And so I was just, thinking about how when you are mentally broken, you're also physically broken, and your appearance can change. And that's all.
Hey, can I throw in something?
Sure thing.
Thank you. The Chestnut, because it's the Chestnut Cafe also. So, I'm thinking about like the whole chess thing, and then so chestnut, it kind of feels like a Welsing moment with the chestnut, and then it's under the spreading chestnut tree. I kind of feel like that's like then I sold you and you sold me. It's kind of like I'm thinking about like race, about slavery, and about how white people had no problem with treating the black female and the black male, by association as just commodity, and breeding, so-called breeding. They could just rape them, whatever. It's the spreading chestnut tree. I sold you and you sold me. The chess reference also. And a chestnut is dark. Nut. So.
Very logical. Let's see. We should have 9325. Your line should be open, and 6151. Your line should be open as well.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Greetings, Gus, the other callers. What stood out to me is the 3 stages in his reintegration that O'Brien was speaking of. And then when I looked into it deeper, I thought that it was more like 4 stages, because O'Brien was speaking of learning, understanding, and acceptance. But they didn't mention the preparation, because Winston went through quite a bit before he got into the learning stage. From what I got from it was the preliminary phase was the use of mental and physical torture to confuse Winston in preparing him for learning, similar to the mind control techniques that's used in the military and the prison system. Victims of white supremacy or the enslaved Africans were subjected to the same tactics during the antebellum South, where they were starved, whipped, hanged, castrated, and tortured, and many other violent means. And also, the male caller referred to the betrayal that was going on throughout the book. I think I had mentioned that earlier, too. And last week, one of the callers mentioned the physical condition of Winston being an impotent individual, sort of weak. And if any of the callers had seen a picture of George Orwell, I think that image that he was using, the characterization of Winston, very much resembled himself. And I was wondering if any of the other callers recognized that earlier in the book, when Winston was being tortured, O'Brien asked Winston what country Oceania was at war with. And the answer at that time was East Asia. But then later in this section of the book, when Winston was sitting in the Chestnut Tree Cafe, and the telescreen broadcast, Oceania was at war with Eurasia. Also, the three persons of Jones, Erickson, and Rutherford, I think the similarity was that they were tortured in room 101 along with Winston, but I don't think every one of the characters actually went to room 101. I think there were different either phases of torture or different types of reintegration processes done on the different characters. I seem to be fluctuating between whether Julia was actually a spy, because O'Brien would not mention whether she was tortured or not. She did have a scar on her head, but then I thought it was sort of coincidental that when O'Brien was speaking about the rats being able to attack a baby that's left alone in the house, it was the same phrase that Julia had used earlier in the book. And it just seems coincidental that it would be the exact same phrase. It's almost like, something else was going on undercover. Also, Winston's job as a C.O.W.S, which is actually a job where you do nothing, but you get paid. The black hordes, when they were speaking about Africa, and the fact that white always mates, and the chess game was considered a Dr. Wilson's moment. That's what I have right now.
Can I be heard?
You're a little low. If you could speak up, please.
Can you hear me better now?
Yes, sir.
When Winston and Julie, when Winston turned on Julia with the rats, like with the fear of the rats attacking him and everything like that, and later on they spoke, and Julia kind of was like, she was telling him like, he would rather have it be her that was attacked by the rat. It was like she was disappointed in him, and he was disappointed in himself, but she didn't really blame him because she knew he was in fear, but still she was disappointed, and like they both said, it'll never be the same. And it kind of reminded me of kind of a norm, like many situations. Like one is like when Africa was attacked by Europeans and Arabs, how I'm gonna use the Arabs and the Europeans in this scenario like threats. So we put it like we turned on each other. You see what I'm saying? Out of fear. And African Americans, I'm not speaking for each individual. Each individual is different. But I'm looking at the whole frame of the thing or whatever like that. As a whole, it's like African Americans understand what happened, but it's like, as a whole, it's like, we still throw that up in a lot of topics. Like, well, Africans, like if you was to talk to another black person about racism or European oppression of people of color, they'll throw it up in your face. Well, Africans saw other Africans in the slavery. You see what I'm saying? It's like, it's kind of like they looking at it like Julia was looking at Winston. And another thing is like, another scenario that kind of put me in mind of is the situation in the African American family. Like, they create a system of white supremacy, racism, job discrimination, and the females understand that males can't provide for them because we don't own the businesses, and we face job discrimination on a huge scale, male and female. But males always had the role of the provider, so it's like they don't blame us because they know, like I said, the torture and the oppression and, like I said, the fear of the rat. So they don't blame us, but at the same time, it's like they don't it's like, let me word this correctly. They don't blame us, but still it's like a unspoken, well, even though you face those obstacles or you face that right there, you still should overcome that. And you know what I'm saying? I hope I worded it right, but yeah, I mute my line.
I just want to throw in that I was looking at the movies. I was looking at a list of movies that are coming out in February yesterday, just see what kind of black depictions are going to be out there during February this year. But Dwayne Johnson, a.k.a. The Rock, non-white male, he's going to be in a movie called Snitch, where he is a snitch, and he's, like, working for the DA or something, like, to bust some crime ring or whatever. But that kind of resonated with me, what the gentleman, the previous speaker was saying about the other meaning of the word rat. So that was interesting.
Does anybody, the folks that are online now, the situation, I think a couple of people have touched on where he's in room 101, the rats, O'Brien brings them in. He knows Winston is deathly afraid. This has come up before, in fact, in the room where they were captured, where he had been talking, telling Julia that he was afraid of rats. I think a rat came in the room and she threw something at it or what have you, and he said he was really afraid. So I'm sure they had known that for quite some time. Getting the male and female to turn on one another, and even put male putting the female in harm's way and vice versa. I think this is something that comes up frequently in the history of racism, white supremacy. I know I was speaking to Mr. Fuller a couple weeks ago, and he reminded me of Fannie Lou Hamer, black female during the 60s so-called civil rights era, when she was one of the times when she was imprisoned. The racists who operated the prison, they would get black male prisoners to beat her. And he was saying this is a standard tactic that racists use, particularly to keep that male-female tension going. Got to stir that up, maintain that. I think that's something that's it's important to be honest about, the fact that racist man, racist woman can maintain that dynamic as long as they are in charge, and putting people that they have under their submission that are subject to them, putting them in positions where they will, quote unquote, betray one another, where they will use one of their victims to abuse and mistreat other victims that are all subject to them. I think that's something that's real important, that we're honest about, and making sure that we direct any animosity, any rage, that it's correctly directed at the correct people, which would be white people. But I think that's something that definitely it seems like it's one of their most effective methods of maintaining racism, white supremacy. It has that lasting. Matter of fact, it reminds me of Pam and the folks at Trojan Horse Publications, the second book, Black Love is a Revolutionary Act, where they have the anecdote at the beginning where a white prowler breaks into the home of a black male and black female. They're married, breaks into the home and rapes the black female in front of the black male. And she continues with the story, where they end up being really hostile towards each other afterwards and blaming each other, and their marriage falls apart, and they both end up just being very bitter about that whole situation. I think white people are very skilled at recreating that dynamic all throughout the history of white supremacy. I don't know, just anybody have any other thoughts around that?
I agree, Gus, and it's probably going to sound redundant, but yes, the whole rats in the cage phenomenon, where we turn on each other rather than turning on the person who put us in the cage. Reminds me of crabs in a bucket as well.
Yeah, I would also definitely agree with that, and it's insidious because because it's indirect, so you can't address it unless like us, we're talking about it directly, the context of white supremacy, but the people outside of our little circle are like gonna be adhering to that. They're gonna be going against what we're saying and stuff, and not realizing it because it's coming at this crazy angle all sideways. So then if it was direct, then we would be able to directly address it. So it definitely plays out in my life more than I'd like it to.
I have a situation similar to that happened to me on the job, where another non-white individual, well, actually, the way the story went is that every so often a committee of employees would elect one of the employees as Employee of the Month. So one of the guys on the committee asked me to say a few things about stuff that he could write me up as Employee of the Month. So one of the things that I told him is that one of the other employees had injured himself at the job, and he was on a workman's comp injury, so I was having to pull a lot of the load, in his absence. As one of the things that I told him, besides a few other things that I said. But when the guy did come back to work, the individual went and told the guy that I said he didn't come to work on a regular basis. So that caused a rift between myself and the injured employee, and he, started an argument and wanted to invite me out into the parking lot and this and that, and he proceeded to threaten me, curse me out, and this and that, and this was on federal property. So I contemplated on whether or not I should, take it upstairs, but the supervisor, who was another non-white person, was present while it was going on, and he didn't do anything about it. So to make a long story short, it was really two non-white employees pitted against each other, and I was wondering whether or not I should involve white people to solve the squabbling that was going on between two non-white people. So to make a long story short, we ended up going into a resolution, and they asked me if I wanted to file charges on the guy where he would have lost his job, and I chose not to file charges, and pretty soon the whole thing blew over, and we were able to talk to each other again and all that. But that's one incident that I think being skilled at counter racism and knowing what happens in these type of cases, prevented me from wanting vengeance on an employee, and he's a victim himself, actually.
I think that very important what you just said. I think that popped up last week as well, keeping in mind that all of us non-white people are victims. All of us are subject to racist man, racist woman, racist child. And even that portion where he's talking to Winston in room 101 before he puts the rats close to him, where he says, everybody, it's almost what I was saying previously, where everybody has a breaking point, where he tells them, it might be fear of drowning, it might be fear of fire, it might not even be something that's fatal, it might be something, seemingly silly. Everybody has a breaking point. And I think that's really important with regards to keeping that in mind with non-white people and accurately calibrating our expectations of other non-white people, whether it's that this non-white person, white people can easily manipulate this person because he or she wants to keep their job. They can easily control this person because they want to make sure they can feed their children. They want to make sure they can pay their rent. They want to make sure that they're not the one that has to go to jail. Serve 20 years, serve 10 years, serve 5 years. White people all over the world exercise that control over non-white people, whether it's rats or whatever else. And I think it's real important to keep that in mind with regards to what we expect of other non-white people, as long as white people dominate the entire planet. Very important, I think, to kind of keep down those sorts of situations. That chess example I also thought was real significant. I guess 2 points I'll make real quick, and then if y'all have any comments or what have you, we should have another 10-15 minutes before we get to the second audio segment. The chess segment I thought was really important as well. I think a couple people touched on that as a Wellsing moment. Significant just because I think a lot of the books that white people books or stories, they could be films that white people put a lot of importance on, chess pops in. If you check out Casablanca, also came out same time that this came out in the 1940s. Casablanca, there's a scene where they are playing chess in the middle of the movie. Very successful film, very important film, I think, on a lot of white people's lists. It's on one of the top 10 films of all time. Casablanca, even the name, Casablanca. The film Shawshank Redemption, also playing chess. I think the main white character who's in prison builds his own chess set. Very important. I think that is a mnemonic where white people understand the significance of that and what that is supposed to keep their focus on. The fact that white is supposed to be going first, as Dr. Wellsing points out consistently, white is supposed to be going first. White is supposed to initiate the aggression. And I think, as Orwell points out in the book here, white is always supposed to triumph. I actually wanted to get the exact wording that he used here. He says white always mates. Even the double entendre there, the sexual significance of mating. But white always mates, he thought, with a sort of cloudy mysticism. Always, without exception, it is so arranged. It is no chess problem since the beginning. In no chess problem since the beginning of the world has black ever won. Did it not symbolize the eternal, unwavering triumph of good over evil? The huge face gazed back at him, full of calm power. White always mates. Real powerful section of the book, in my opinion, and it goes right from that right into the section about control of Africa. Gotta have control of Africa. This is hugely important for world domination. Gotta have control of the continent of Africa. I just thought that was very significant, and that is a recurrent theme. Even Mr. Fuller, he was talking about that a couple weeks ago, about the significance of when you see white people playing chess and popping up in films, and just that, in my view, it is a mnemonic to remind them of what the game of life is all about. White dominating black, non-white, worldwide, forever. See, I guess the other quick point, I think I don't remember which caller it was, but the caller that was saying that they felt there might be some relationship between the Winston's character and Orwell. They were saying they felt like Winston, being this kind of weak, helpless person in the book, and even maybe looking similar to Orwell. People who've seen pictures of what he looks like, George Orwell. The essay that I opened the broadcast with today, Why I Write, that Orwell wrote in 1946, a couple years before this book was published. At the very beginning, he says, he's talking about himself, for this and other reasons, I was somewhat lonely, and I soon developed disagreeable mannerisms which made me unpopular throughout my school days. I had the lonely child's habit of making up stories and holding conversations with imaginary persons, and I think from the very start my literary ambitions were mixed up with the feeling of being isolated and undervalued. I knew that I had a facility with words and a power of facing unpleasant facts, and I felt that this created a sort of private world in which I could get my own back for my failure in everyday life. I feel like that sounds very similar to Winston's character in this book, even what motivates Winston to start writing his diary at the very beginning of the book to begin with. I don't know, anybody have any thoughts on that?
Yes, I made the statement about the similarity of Orwell himself and his character Winston. They seem very similar. And if you look at his lifespan, George Orwell actually didn't live very long. I think he died before he was 50 years old, and he was sick a lot of that time. So they seem very similar.
Someone, they had a hand up that dialed in, their line was open, but I don't know if they got disconnected or what have you. If you have something you would like to share, dial in. We should have maybe another 10 minutes before we get to the second audio segment. I'll give out the number one more time: 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Press star 6 if you would like to participate. Again, we have about another 10 minutes. If you don't get your commentary in before we get to the second audio segment, don't worry, just write it down so you don't forget it, and we will get to you after the second audio segment concludes. We got another 10 minutes. If anybody has anything they want to share, folks who haven't dialed in, if you have anything you want to add to the conversation.
I think one other thing I'd like to mention right quick is that during his questioning, and Winston was, they screamed abuse at him and threatening. And then at every hesitation would deliver him over to the guards again. They would threaten to do that. And then suddenly they would change their tune and call him a comrade and appeal to him. So sometimes when we're dealing with a hostile situation, it may turn into a screaming match. But I think it's important that you maintain a calm mannerism so that you can actually think what your next move will be, and that diffuses the situation, because if you become excited when the other person is excited, it seems to just escalate. So I think that would be a good tip that we all should keep in mind. I'll mute my line.
Great point. I wanted to speak to what Gus was saying about the connection between Winston and what you were reading about George Orwell seeming to have something to prove, or it kind of seemed like he was had some inadequacy that was playing out in being a top dog in a literary sense, but being kind of physically inadequate and socially, being like the mind above the body. In that, again, Urugu, it's kind of a scenario. I keep on bringing that up a lot, but it relates. But I found it very interesting that the language, like all the language, like how you were saying how the chess thing came up right before they started talking about the African front and like how they're charging south, and then they're talking about the war in the Congo and all this stuff. And in the beginning of the passage, the beginning of the audio clip, they're talking about the white light and how he was dreaming about this golden place where he's hanging out with all the other, suspected racists, all the other white people in the book, like whether or not they're on his side. He's O'Brien and all these other people in this golden place, and then he was talking about the white light was above him, and then he's sitting. He had a stool to sit on, and I'm thinking about the word stool and how the word stool has another meaning. As to stool with the E at the end, and it means feces, and then a stool to sit on. And I'm just thinking about the connections in the English language, how like there are these weird but pertinent connections, like where the stool is underneath his backside, and then you could say another type of stool goes there, and then it's like stool is brown. Usually stool is made out of wood. I just saw a lot of connections like that, and I'll stop there. Somebody else can share.
Yeah, those are homonyms, homophones, words that sound the same but have different meanings. Fair is another one. F-A-I-R, F-A-R-E, another one. But yeah, I was thinking the same thing when he was using the word stool in the book. I was thinking the same thing. That might even be another Wellsing moment in the book. And with the amount of understanding that Mr. Orwell has of language, and particularly the English language, I suspect that might have been purposeful. That might have been something that he was aware of and using deliberately as a tool in the book. So yeah, I think that's a very important point folks should think about. Guess any final thoughts, last minute or so before we go to the second segment of the book? That way we'll have enough time to discuss any closing thoughts. Definitely words. The book will end and there's an appendix. I was incorrect. I thought when we were starting out with this book that the appendix, which maybe even should be at the beginning of the book, but the book closes, there's an appendix where Orwell explains Newspeak and the terms that they use in the book, double plus good and ungood and that sort of thing. He goes into some detail to explain the Newspeak language, if you will. So that'll be the conclusion of the audiobook. After the novel ends, then you get this explanation of the terms. So I would say definitely pay attention to that. I think it is super important, and I hear some of these Newspeak terms being used as well. I don't think I've heard double plus good or anything like that, but I do hear terms like thought crime being used, ungood, some of the other terms that came directly from this book. I do hear them being used even now. So I would definitely say pay attention to that, the structuring and the thought that went into how he came up with this language for the book. Definitely pay attention to that, as well as how everything wraps up with the book. Anything else anyone wanted to share before we finish up? Go to second audio segment.
I wanted to just put this out there. It may be stretching it a bit, but I think I read somewhere that someone mentioned the possibility that Julia could have gotten pregnant during their encounters earlier, which might account for the way she looked when he saw her. She had changed. Her waistline was bigger. Her feet were bigger. And he couldn't recognize her when she was walking off. And I don't know if that's the only indication, but somewhere I read that, and I thought that may have been stretching a little bit, but maybe someone else had noticed that too.
Well, what I'm thinking about is that before, like in the beginning of the book, she was his enemy. Like he was talking about, the knocking her head in and all this stuff, and like whatever, raping her, and all this craziness, when she was like showing all this, party loyalty in front of the 5 Minute Hate or whatever. And she had the sash around her waist, and she was part of this anti-sex group. So it's like she was going around this virtuous, virginal kind of like, powerful. They were always outside and doing physical things. She's playing sports and being virgins or whatever. But it's like, I guess now it's like she's kind of like out. Like her secret is out, she's obviously, living a lascivious life. And I don't know if she's pregnant or what, but I mean, she's not, part of that group anymore where they're all like, marching around, acting like they're these virtuous people. She's like more sedentary, more, homely. I don't know. It's my thought.
It's an interesting observation. I hadn't thought of whether or not she could be pregnant right there, but definitely could be. I don't know. I'm not sure that she will pop back up anymore towards the end of the book, but that is definitely a possibility. She could have been pregnant. Yeah, that's one to ponder on as we migrate towards the end of the book. We have about 30 minutes before the conclusion. If you want to be thinking of major themes to take away, I would definitely, again, emphasize paying attention to the appendix at the end where they break down the language. But major themes from the book, major takeaway points, what you think. If you had to explain, if a non-white person came to ask you any questions about this book, anything that you would tell them with regards to why they should check it out or what you learned, major themes that stick out from the book, even the influence. As I said, it's continuing. Someone I think commented on the most recent broadcast. They were saying Oliver Stone's series on Showtime, The Untold History of America, I think that's what it's called, where he has all these references to George Orwell, and I think specifically to 1984, not just to Orwell in general. And I heard him do an interview about a week ago. He did about a 15-minute interview where he had a lot of those 1984 references there, and they said, I think it's a weekly broadcast. They do it in segments, and I think they were saying in the most recent segment that there were a lot of references there as well. So if you have any thoughts on that, why this book has such significance for white people under the system of white supremacy, kind of share that, and as I said, other main themes that you would take away from the text. This will be our final segment. Mr. George Orwell, 1984, Context of White Supremacy.
A passing waiter noticed that his glass was empty and came back with a gin bottle. He took up his glass and sniffed at it. The stuff grew not less but more horrible with every mouthful he drank. But it had become the element he swam in. It was his life, his death, and his resurrection. It was gin that sank him into a stupor every night, and gin that revived him every morning. When he woke, seldom before 1100, with gummed-up eyelids and fiery mouth and a back that seemed to be broken, it would have been impossible even to rise from the horizontal if it had not been for the bottle and teacup placed beside the bed overnight. Through the midday hours he sat with glazed face, the bottle handy, listening to the telescreen. From 15 to closing time he was a fixture in the chestnut tree. No one cared what he did any longer. No whistle woke him, no telescreen admonished him. Occasionally, perhaps twice a week, he went to a dusty, forgotten-looking office in the Ministry of Truth and did little work, or what was called work. He had been appointed to a subcommittee of a subcommittee which had sprouted from one of the innumerable committees dealing with minor difficulties that arose in the compilation of the 11th edition of the Newspeak dictionary. They were engaged in producing something called an interim report, but what it was that they were reporting on he had never definitely found out. It was something to do with the question of whether commas should be placed inside brackets or outside. There were 4 others on the committee, all of them persons similar to himself. There were days when they assembled and then promptly dispersed again, frankly admitting to one another that there was not really anything to be done. But there were other days when they settled down to their work almost eagerly, making a tremendous show of entering up their minutes and drafting long memoranda which were never finished, when the argument as to what they were supposedly arguing about grew extraordinarily involved and abstruse, with subtle hagglings over definitions, enormous digressions, quarrels, threats even to appeal to higher authority. And then suddenly the life would go out of them, and they would sit around the table looking at one another with extinct eyes, like ghosts fading at cockcrow. The telescreen was silent for a moment. Winston raised his head again. The bulletin. But no, they were merely changing the music. He had the map of Africa behind his eyelids. The movement of the armies was a diagram, a black arrow tearing vertically southward and a white arrow tearing horizontally eastward across the tail of the first. As though for reassurance, he looked up at the imperturbable face in the portrait. Was it conceivable that the second arrow did not even exist? His interest flagged again. He drank another mouthful of gin, picked up the White Knight, and made a tentative move. Check. But it was evidently not the right move, because Uncalled, a memory floated into his mind. He saw a candle-lit room with a vast white counterpaned bed, and himself, a boy of 9 or 10, sitting on the floor shaking a dice box and laughing excitedly. His mother was sitting opposite him and also laughing. It must have been about a month before she disappeared. It was a moment of reconciliation, when the nagging hunger in his belly was forgotten and his earlier affection for her had temporarily revived. He remembered the day well, a pelting, drenching day when the water streamed down the window pane and the light indoors was too dull to read by. The boredom of the 2 children in the dark, cramped bedroom became unbearable. Winston whined and grizzled, made futile demands for food, fretted about the room, pulling everything out of place and kicking the wainscoting until the neighbors banged on the wall, while the younger child wailed intermittently. In the end his mother had said, "Now be good and I'll buy you a toy, a lovely toy, you'll love it." And then she'd gone out in the rain to a little general shop which was still sporadically open nearby, and come back with a cardboard box containing an outfit of snakes and ladders. He could still remember the smell of the damp cardboard. It was a miserable outfit. The board was cracked, and the tiny wooden dice were so ill-cut that they would hardly lie on their sides. Winston looked at the thing sulkily and without interest, but then his mother lit a piece of candle, and they sat down on the floor to play. Soon he was wildly excited and shouting with laughter as the tiddlywinks climbed hopefully up the ladders and then came slithering down the snakes again, almost back to the starting point. They played 8 games, winning 4 each. His tiny sister, too young to understand what the game was about, had sat propped up against a bolster, laughing because the others were laughing. For a whole afternoon they had all been happy together, as in his earlier childhood. He pushed the picture out of his mind. It was a false memory. He was troubled by false memories occasionally. They did not matter so long as one knew them for what they were. Some things had happened, others had not happened. He turned back to the chessboard and picked up the white knight again. Almost in the same instant it dropped onto the board with a clatter. He had started as though a pin had run into him. A shrill trumpet call had pierced the air. It was the bulletin. Victory! It always meant victory when a trumpet call preceded the news. A sort of electric thrill ran through the cafe. Even the waiters had started and pricked up their ears. The trumpet call had let loose an enormous volume of noise. Already an excited voice was gabbling from the telescreen, but even as it started it was almost drowned by a roar of cheering from outside. The news had run round the streets like magic. He could hear just enough of what was issuing from the telescreen to realize that it had all happened as he had foreseen. A vast sea-borne armada secretly assembled, a sudden blow in the enemy's rear, the white arrow tearing across the tail of the black. Fragments of triumphant phrases pushed themselves through the din. Vast strategic maneuver, perfect coordination, utter rout, 500,000 prisoners, complete demoralization, control of the whole of Africa, bring the war within measurable distance of its end. Victory, greatest victory in human history. Victory, victory, victory. Under the table, Winston's feet made convulsive movements. He had not stirred from his seat, but in his mind he was running, swiftly running. He was with the crowds outside, cheering himself deaf. He looked up again at the portrait of Big Brother, the colossus that bestrode the world, the rock against which the hordes of Asia dashed themselves in vain. He thought how 10 minutes ago, yes, only 10 minutes, there had still been equivocation in his heart as he wondered whether the news from the front would be of victory or defeat. Ah, it was much more than a Eurasian army that had perished. Much had changed in him since the first day in the Ministry of Love, but the final, indispensable, healing change had never happened until this moment. The voice from the telescreen was still pouring forth its tale of prisoners and booty and slaughter, but the shouting outside had died down a little. The waiters were turning back to their work. One of them approached with the gin bottle. Winston, sitting in a blissful dream, paid no attention as his glass was filled up. He was not running or cheering any longer. He was back in the Ministry of Love, with everything forgiven, his soul white as snow. He was in the public dock, confessing everything, implicating everybody. He was walking down the white-tiled corridor with the feeling of walking in sunlight, and an armed guard at his back. The long-hoped-for bullet was entering his brain. He gazed up at the enormous face, 40 years it had taken him to learn what kind of smile was hidden beneath the dark mustache. Oh, cruel, needless misunderstanding. Oh, stubborn, self-willed exile from the loving breast. 2 gin-scented tears trickled down the sides of his nose. But it was all right. Everything was all right. The struggle was finished. He had won the victory over himself. He loved Big Brother.
The End. You have been listening to 1984 by George Orwell, narrated by Frank Muller. Orwell includes an appendix explaining the principles of Newspeak, and which we present here.
Newspeak was the official language of Oceania, and had been devised to meet the ideological needs of INGSOC, or English Socialism. In the year 1984, there was not as yet anyone who used Newspeak as his sole means of communication, either in speech or writing. The leading articles in the Times were written in it, but this was a tour de force which could only be carried out by a specialist. It was expected that Newspeak would have finally superseded Oldspeak, or Standard English as we should call it, by about the year 2050. Meanwhile, it gained ground steadily, all party members tending to use Newspeak words and grammatical constructions more and more in their everyday speech. The version in use in 1984 and embodied in the 9th and 10th editions of the Newspeak Dictionary was a provisional one, and contained many superfluous words and archaic formations which were due to be suppressed later. It is with the final, perfected version, as embodied in the 11th edition of the dictionary, that we are concerned here. The purpose of Newspeak was not only to provide a medium of expression for the world view and mental habits proper to the devotees of INGSOC, but to make all other modes of thought impossible. It was intended that when Newspeak had been adopted once and for all, and Oldspeak forgotten, a heretical thought, that is, a thought diverging from the principles of INGSOC, should be literally unthinkable, at least so far as thought is dependent on words. Its vocabulary was so constructed as to give exact and often very subtle expression to every meaning that a party member could properly wish to express, while excluding all other meanings and also the possibility of arriving at them by indirect methods. This was done partly by the invention of new words, but chiefly by eliminating undesirable words and by stripping such words as remained of unorthodox meanings, and so far as possible of all secondary meanings whatever. To give a single example, the word free still existed in Newspeak, but it could only be used in such statements as, "This dog is free from lice," or "This field is free from weeds." It could not be used in its old sense of politically free or intellectually free, since political and intellectual freedom no longer existed even as concepts, and were therefore of necessity nameless. Quite apart from the suppression of definitely heretical words, reduction of vocabulary was regarded as an end in itself, and no word that could be dispensed with was allowed to survive. Newspeak was designed not to extend but to diminish the range of thought, and this purpose was indirectly assisted by cutting the choice of words down to a minimum. Newspeak was founded on the English language as we now know it, though many Newspeak sentences, even when not containing newly created words, would be barely intelligible to an English speaker of our own day. Newspeak words were divided into 3 distinct classes, known as the A vocabulary, the B vocabulary, also called compound words, and the C vocabulary. It will be simpler to discuss each class separately, but the grammatical peculiarities of the language can be dealt with in the section devoted to the A vocabulary, since the same rules held good for all 3 categories. The A vocabulary. The A vocabulary consisted of words needed for the business of everyday life, for such things as eating, drinking, working, putting on one's clothes, going up and down stairs, riding in vehicles, gardening, cooking, and the like. It was composed almost entirely of words that we already possess, words like hit, run, dog, tree, sugar, house, field. But in comparison with the present-day English vocabulary, their number was extremely small, while their meanings were far more rigidly defined. All ambiguities and shades of meaning had been purged out of them. So far as it could be achieved, a Newspeak word of this class was simply a staccato sound expressing one clearly understood concept. It would have been quite impossible to use the A vocabulary for literary purposes or for political or philosophical discussion. It was intended only to express simple, purposive thoughts, usually involving concrete objects or physical actions. The grammar of Newspeak had two outstanding peculiarities. The first of these was an almost complete interchangeability between different parts of speech. Any word in the language, in principle this applied even to very abstract words such as if or when, could be used either as a verb, noun, adjective, or adverb. Between the verb and the noun form, when they were of the same root, there was never any variation, this rule of itself involving the destruction of many archaic forms. The word thought, for example, did not exist in Newspeak. Its place was taken by think, which did duty for both noun and verb. No etymological principle was involved here. In some cases it was the original noun that was chosen for retention, in other cases the verb. Even where a noun and verb of kindred meaning were not etymologically connected, one or other of them was frequently suppressed. There was, for example, no such word as cut, its meaning being sufficiently covered by the noun-verb knife. Adjectives were formed by adding the suffix full to the noun-verb, and adverbs by adding wise. Thus, for example, speedful meant rapid, and speedwise meant quickly. Certain of our present-day adjectives, such as good, strong, big, black, soft, were retained, but their total number was very small. There was little need for them, since almost any adjectival meaning could be arrived at by adding full to a noun verb. None of the now existing adverbs was retained except for a very few already ending in wise. The wise termination was invariable. The word well, for example, was replaced by goodwise. In addition, any word, this again applied in principle to every word in the language, could be negatived by adding the affix un, or could be strengthened by the affix plus, or, for still greater emphasis, double plus. Thus, for example, uncold meant warm, while plus cold and double plus cold meant, respectively, very cold and superlatively cold. It was also possible, as in present-day English, to modify the meaning of almost any word by prepositional affixes such as ante, post, up, down, etc. By such methods it was found possible to bring about an enormous diminution of vocabulary. Given, for instance, the word good, there was no need for such a word as bad, since the required meaning was equally well, indeed better, expressed by ungood. All that was necessary, in any case where two words formed a natural pair of opposites, was to decide which of them to suppress. Dark, for example, could be replaced by unlight, or light by undark, according to preference. The second distinguishing mark of Newspeak grammar was its regularity. Subject to a few exceptions, which are mentioned below, all inflections followed the same rules. Thus, in all verbs, the preterite and the past participle were the same, and ended in ed. The preterite of steal was stealed. The preterite of think was thinked, and so on throughout the language, all such forms as swam, gave, brought, spoke, taken, etc. being abolished. All plurals were made by adding s or es, as the case might be. The plurals of man, ox, life were mans, oxes, lifes. Comparison of adjectives was invariably made by adding er, est, good, gooder, goodest, irregular forms and the more, most formation being suppressed. The only classes of words that were still allowed to inflect irregularly were the pronouns, the relatives, the demonstrative adjectives, and the auxiliary verbs. All of these followed their ancient usage, except that whom had been scrapped as unnecessary, and the shall, should tenses had been dropped, all their uses being covered by will and would. There were also certain irregularities in word formation arising out of the need for rapid and easy speech. A word which was difficult to utter or was liable to be incorrectly heard was held to be ipso facto a bad word. Occasionally, therefore, for the sake of euphony, extra letters were inserted into a word, or an archaic formation was retained. But this need made itself felt chiefly in connection with the B vocabulary. Why so great an importance was attached to ease of pronunciation will be made clear later in this essay. The B vocabulary. The B vocabulary consisted of words which had been deliberately constructed for political purposes, words, that is to say, which not only had in every case a political implication, but were intended to impose a desirable mental attitude upon the person using them. Without a full understanding of the principles of Ingsoc, it was difficult to use these words correctly. In some cases, they could be translated into Old Speak or even into words taken from the A vocabulary, but this usually demanded a long paraphrase and always involved the loss of certain overtones. The B words were a sort of verbal shorthand, often packing whole ranges of ideas into a few syllables, and at the same time more accurate and forcible than ordinary language. The B words were, in all cases, compound words. Compound words such as speak right were of course to be found in the A vocabulary, but these were merely convenient abbreviations and had no special ideological color. They consisted of two or more words or portions of words welded together in an easily pronounceable form. The resulting amalgam was always a noun verb and inflected according to the ordinary rules. To take a single example, the word good think, meaning very roughly orthodoxy, or if one chose to regard it as a verb, to think in an orthodox manner, this inflected as follows: noun verb, good think; past tense and past participle, good thinked; present participle, good thinking; adjective, good thinkful; adverb, good think wise; verbal noun, good thinker. The B words were not constructed on any etymological plan. The words of which they were made up could be any parts of speech and could be placed in any order and mutilated in any way which made them easy to pronounce while indicating their derivation. In the word crime think, thought crime, for instance, the think came second, whereas in think pol, thought police, it came first, and in the latter word police had lost its second syllable. Because of the greater difficulty in securing euphony, irregular formations were commoner in the B vocabulary than in the A vocabulary. For example, the adjectival forms of mini-true, mini-pax, and mini-love were, respectively, mini-truthful, mini-peaceful, and mini-lovely, simply because truthful, paxful, and loveful were slightly awkward to pronounce. In principle, however, all B words could inflect, and all inflected in exactly the same way. Some of the B words had highly subtilized meanings, barely intelligible to anyone who had not mastered the language as a whole. Consider, for example, such a typical sentence from a Times leading article as "Old thinkers unbellyfeel ingsoc." The shortest rendering that one could make of this in Old Speak would be, "Those whose ideas were formed before the Revolution cannot have a full emotional understanding of the principles of English socialism." But this is not an adequate translation. To begin with, in order to grasp the full meaning of the Newspeak sentence quoted above, one would have to have a clear idea of what is meant by ingsoc. And, in addition, only a person thoroughly grounded in ingsoc could appreciate the full force of the word bellyfeel, which implied a blind, enthusiastic acceptance difficult to imagine today, or of the word old think, which was inextricably mixed up with the idea of wickedness and decadence. But the special function of certain Newspeak words, of which old think was one, was not so much to express meanings as to destroy them. These words, necessarily few in number, had had their meanings extended until they contained within themselves whole batteries of words which, as they were sufficiently covered by a single comprehensive term, could now be scrapped and forgotten. The greatest difficulty facing the compilers of the Newspeak dictionary was not to invent new words, but, having invented them, to make sure what they meant, to make sure, that is to say, what ranges of words they cancelled by their existence. As we have already seen in the case of the word free, words which had once borne a heretical meaning were sometimes retained for the sake of convenience, but only with the undesirable meanings purged out of them. Countless other words, such as honor, justice, morality, internationalism, democracy, science, and religion, had simply ceased to exist. A few blanket words covered them, and in covering them, abolished them. All words grouping themselves round the concepts of liberty and equality, for instance, were contained in the single word crime-think, while all words grouping themselves round the concepts of objectivity and rationalism were contained in the single word old-think. Greater precision would have been dangerous. What was required in a party member was an outlook similar to that of the ancient Hebrew who knew, without knowing much else, that all nations other than his own worshipped false gods. He did not need to know that these gods were called Baal, Osiris, Moloch, Ashtaroth, and the like. Probably the less he knew about them, the better for his orthodoxy. He knew Jehovah and the commandments of Jehovah. He knew, therefore, that all gods with other names or other attributes were false gods. In somewhat the same way, the party member knew what constituted right conduct, and in exceedingly vague, generalized terms, he knew what kinds of departure from it were possible. His sexual life, for example, was entirely regulated by the two Newspeak words sex crime, sexual immorality, and good sex, chastity. Sex crime covered all sexual misdeeds whatever. It covered fornication, adultery, homosexuality, and other perversions, and in addition normal intercourse practiced for its own sake. There was no need to enumerate them separately, since they were all equally culpable and, in principle, all punishable by death. In the C vocabulary, which consisted of scientific and technical words, it might be necessary to give specialized names to certain sexual aberrations, but the ordinary citizen had no need of them. He knew what was meant by good sex. That is to say, normal intercourse between man and wife for the sole purpose of begetting children and without physical pleasure on the part of the woman. All else was sex crime. In Newspeak, it was seldom possible to follow a heretical thought further than the perception that it was heretical. Beyond that point, the necessary words were non-existent. No word in the B vocabulary was ideologically neutral. A great many were euphemisms. Such words, for instance, as joy camp, forced labor camp, or mini-pax, ministry of peace, i.e. ministry of war, meant almost the exact opposite of what they appeared to mean. Some words, on the other hand, displayed a frank and contemptuous understanding of the real nature of oceanic society. An example was prole feed, meaning the rubbishy entertainment and spurious news which the party handed out to the masses. Other words, again, were ambivalent, having the connotation good when applied to the party and bad when applied to its enemies. But in addition there were great numbers of words which at first sight appeared to be mere abbreviations and which derived their ideological color not from their meaning but from their structure. So far as it could be contrived, everything that had or might have political significance of any kind was fitted into the B vocabulary. The name of every organization, or body of people, or doctrine, or country, or institution, or public building was invariably cut down into the familiar shape. That is, a single, easily pronounced word with the smallest number of syllables that would preserve the original derivation. In the Ministry of Truth, for example, the Records Department, in which Winston Smith worked, was called RecDep. The Fiction Department was called FicDep. The Teleprograms Department was called Teledep, and so on. This was not done solely with the object of saving time. Even in the early decades of the 20th century, telescoped words and phrases had been one of the characteristic features of political language, and it had been noticed that the tendency to use abbreviations of this kind was most marked in totalitarian countries and totalitarian organizations. Examples were such words as Nazi, Gestapo, Comintern, Inprocor, Agitprop. In the beginning, the practice had been adopted, as it were, instinctively, but in Newspeak it was used with a conscious purpose. It was perceived that in thus abbreviating a name, one narrowed and subtly altered its meaning by cutting out most of the associations that would otherwise cling to it. The words Communist International, for instance, call up a composite picture of universal human brotherhood, red flags, barricades, Karl Marx, and the Paris Commune. The word Comintern, on the other hand, suggests merely a tightly knit organization and a well-defined body of doctrine. It refers to something almost as easily recognized and as limited in purpose as a chair or a table. Comintern is a word that can be uttered almost without taking thought, whereas Communist International is a phrase over which one is obliged to linger, at least momentarily. In the same way, the associations called up by a word like Mini-True are fewer and more controllable than those called up by Ministry of Truth. This accounted not only for the habit of abbreviating whenever possible, but also for the almost exaggerated care that was taken to make every word easily pronounceable. In Newspeak, euphony outweighed every consideration other than exactitude of meaning. Regularity of grammar was always sacrificed to it when it seemed necessary, and rightly so, since what was required, above all for political purposes, were short, clipped words of unmistakable meaning, which could be uttered rapidly and which roused the minimum of echoes in the speaker's mind. The words of the B vocabulary even gained in force from the fact that nearly all of them were very much alike. Almost invariably, these words, goodthink, mini-pax, prole feed, sex crime, joy camp, ingsoc, bellyfeel, thinkpole, and countless others, were words of 2 or 3 syllables, with the stress distributed equally between the first syllable and the last. The use of them encouraged a gabbling style of speech, at once staccato and monotonous, and this was exactly what was aimed at. The intention was to make speech, and especially speech on any subject not ideologically neutral, as nearly as possible independent of consciousness. For the purposes of everyday life it was no doubt necessary, or sometimes necessary, to reflect before speaking, but a party member called upon to make a political or ethical judgment should be able to spray forth the correct opinions as automatically as a machine gun spraying forth bullets. His training fitted him to do this, the language gave him an almost foolproof instrument, and the texture of the words, with their harsh sound and a certain willful ugliness which was in accord with the spirit of Ingsoc, assisted the process still further. So did the fact of having very few words to choose from. Relative to our own, the Newspeak vocabulary was tiny, and new ways of reducing it were constantly being devised. Newspeak indeed differed from almost all other languages in that its vocabulary grew smaller instead of larger every year. Each reduction was a gain, since the smaller the area of choice, the smaller the temptation to take thought. Ultimately, it was hoped to make articulate speech issue from the larynx without involving the higher brain centers at all. This aim was frankly admitted in the Newspeak word duckspeak, meaning to quack like a duck. Like various other words in the B vocabulary, duckspeak was ambivalent in meaning. Provided that the opinions which were quacked out were orthodox ones, it implied nothing but praise. And when the Times referred to one of the orators of the party as a double plus good duck speaker, it was paying a warm and valued compliment. The C vocabulary. The C vocabulary was supplementary to the others and consisted entirely of scientific and technical terms. These resembled the scientific terms in use today and were constructed from the same roots, but the usual care was taken to define them rigidly and strip them of undesirable meanings. They followed the same grammatical rules as the words in the other two vocabularies. Very few of the C words had any currency either in everyday speech or in political speech. Any scientific worker or technician could find all the words he needed in the list devoted to his own specialty, but he seldom had more than a smattering of the words occurring in the other lists. Only a very few words were common to all lists, and there was no vocabulary expressing the function of science as a habit of mind or a method of thought, irrespective of its particular branches. There was, indeed, no word for science, any meaning that it could possibly bear being already sufficiently covered by the word Ingsoc. From the foregoing account, it will be seen that in Newspeak the expression of unorthodox opinions above a very low level was well nigh impossible. It was, of course, possible to utter heresies of a very crude kind, a species of blasphemy. It would have been possible, for example, to say, "Big Brother is ungood." But this statement, which to an orthodox ear merely conveyed a self-evident absurdity, could not have been sustained by reasoned argument because the necessary words were not available. Ideas inimical to Ingsoc could only be entertained in a vague, wordless form, and could only be named in very broad terms which lumped together and condemned whole groups of heresies without defining them in doing so. One could, in fact, only use Newspeak for unorthodox purposes by illegitimately translating some of the words back into Old Speak. For example, "all mans are equal" was a possible Newspeak sentence, but only in the same sense in which "all men are red-haired" is a possible Old Speak sentence. It did not contain a grammatical error, but it expressed a palpable untruth, i.e. that all men are of equal size, weight, or strength. The concept of political equality no longer existed, and this secondary meaning had accordingly been purged out of the word equal. In 1984, when Old Speak was still the normal means of communication, the danger theoretically existed that in using Newspeak words one might remember their original meanings. In practice, it was not difficult for any person well grounded in doublethink to avoid doing this, but within a couple of generations even the possibility of such a lapse would have vanished. A person growing up with Newspeak as his sole language would no more know that equal had once had the secondary meaning of politically equal, or that free had once meant intellectually free, than, for instance, a person who had never heard of chess would be aware of the secondary meanings attaching to queen and rook. There would be many crimes and errors which it would be beyond his power to commit, simply because they were nameless and therefore unimaginable. And it was to be foreseen that with the passage of time the distinguishing characteristics of Newspeak would become more and more pronounced, its words growing fewer and fewer, their meanings more and more rigid, and the chance of putting them to improper uses always diminishing. When Old Speak had been once and for all superseded, the last link with the past would have been severed. History had already been rewritten, but fragments of the literature of the past survived here and there, imperfectly censored, and so long as one retained one's knowledge of Old Speak it was possible to read them. In the future, such fragments, even if they chanced to survive, would be unintelligible and untranslatable. It was impossible to translate any passage of Old Speak into Newspeak unless it either referred to some technical process or some simple everyday action, or was already orthodox, good thinkful would be the Newspeak expression, in tendency. In practice, this meant that no book written before approximately 1960 could be translated as a whole. Pre-revolutionary literature could only be subjected to ideological translation, that is, alteration in sense as well as language. Take, for example, the well-known passage from the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights governments are instituted among men deriving their powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of those ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it, and to institute new government. It would have been quite impossible to render this into Newspeak while keeping to the sense of the original. The nearest one could come to doing so would be to swallow the whole passage up in the single word, crime-think. A full translation could only be an ideological translation, whereby Jefferson's words would be changed into a panegyric on absolute government. A good deal of the literature of the past was, indeed, already being transformed in this way. Considerations of prestige made it desirable to preserve the memory of certain historical figures, while at the same time bringing their achievements into line with the philosophy of Ingsoc. Various writers, such as Shakespeare, Milton, Swift, Byron, Dickens, and some others, were therefore in process of translation. When the task had been completed, their original writings, with all else that survived of the literature of the past, would be destroyed. These translations were a slow and difficult business, and it was not expected that they would be finished before the first or second decade of the 21st century. There were also large quantities of merely utilitarian literature, indispensable technical manuals and the like, that had to be treated in the same way. It was chiefly in order to allow time for the preliminary work of translation that the final adoption of Newspeak had been fixed for so late a date as 2050.
This concludes the appendix. George Orwell died in 1950 at the age of 47 of a neglected lung ailment, leaving behind a large body of work. Available unabridged from recorded books is Orwell's first book, the largely autobiographical Down and Out in Paris and London.
Context of White Supremacy. The number to dial, 760-569-7676, and the code is 564-943#. Please let us not wait until the last minute. Have a little more than 30 minutes. Should be ample time. Things you would like to share from the conclusion, main points, our final study session on 1984. Our caller in the Bronx, 9325 and B more. Your lines should all be open. If I see any other hands, I'll just open up the lines as I see the hands.
Well, it stuck out to me how he started talking of this, like black and white really started to show up a lot more, I would say, towards the end. But what stuck out to me is when he was talking about his soul being white as snow. He was talking about everything being white. I believe he said the ground, and then he talked about sunlight. So it's this notion again that white is pure and cream. And when I heard that, I thought, and it's really, I guess not really ironic, but sort of ironic, because quote-unquote holiday, Monday, MLK Day, I thought about my favorite speech from him, I want to get the language right. And in this speech, I'm just going to assume everyone's familiar. I'm not going to say anything, but he just talks about how white people have put, you know, these negative connotations of black in the language and things like this, and he talks about how he wants to get the language right. But I thought about that speech And then when they started talking about Newspeak, I broke it down two ways. The first way I broke it down as new speak, and so I was like looking in the dictionary for the definition of the word new, and then I came up with having existed or having been made, but a short period of time, recently manifested, recognized, or experienced, and being other than the former or old. And then I look up the word speak, and I mean that's pretty, self-evident what that means. But I broke it down that way, and then I broke it down as news, N-E-W-S, peak, like a peak of the news. And when I looked up news, it was a report of recent events. And then when I looked up, or something newsworthy, and when I looked up peak, the first definition was to grow thin or sickly, dwindle away. The second definition was pointed or projecting part, and then the third was to reach a maximum. So just those definitions, breaking up as new speak and then news peak, stood out to me.
Greetings. It was very interesting. These are about Newspeak. I wanted to bring up something like the last sentence of the book was pretty of the main text, where he says two gin-scented tears streamed down his cheeks. He loved Big Brother. I guess one sentence. It's pretty powerful. And I was thinking about earlier in the book. I didn't mention this on the first session, but I felt like there was one part where he kept on harping. He kept on he was on this thing where he's talking about smells and about people's scents. He was talking about how there was all these smells around that and people with perfume, or I think maybe perfume was outlawed or something. But I kind of, for some reason, I connected that with now it's lost to me, but I don't know. If someone wants to go back and read that, there was something about smells, something about aroma. And I think something about that it having an attractive kind of, something about perfumes and just smells and how something about attraction, human interactions, attraction and stuff. And it made me think about black people and about how there's these kind of unseen kind of levels of experience that we kind of give off and kind of are attracted to and stuff like that. But the thing about Jinn is a theme that goes through this book pretty hard, from the beginning through the middle and at the very end, I just showed. I'm not sure if maybe the first sentence might have been talking about Jinn. And if you turn the word Jinn around backwards, then you get nig. So because you were saying to look out for the anagrams, and that mice. Rats being star backwards, and then with nig. Jinn, you turn around Jinn, and then you get nig. So I found that as kind of a book-ending kind of a little hidden gem there. And I think the book is all full of these hidden gems, because if you follow it, it's the whole point, I feel it's the style becomes elevated over content. Because it's the whole content becomes described by the style. It's not about what's really important. It's he's really, really, really trying to hammer in the style, and instead of trying to let the content speak for itself in some type of way, it's the style just becomes the thing that the content has to adhere to. And he's relentless. It's just with the Newspeak thing, it's just he doesn't really leave any stone unturned. And I'm wow, I need to I'm kind of I feel like I'm slacking here because this guy is like just really going at it with all the language. Like from the last package, I'll just go real quick through some of the things that stuck out to me in the language, where he connects Crime Stop to talking about, so that he says Crime Stop is a action of like where you're not seeing, and then like a white guy actually years ago was saying how like Nazi from Germany, like they do not see, kind of like there's some wordplay involved there, like Nazi, not seeing. And then like, let's see, he was talking about how his cheekbones were protruding and his nose was flattened. I mean, I don't know what happens to somebody, how their nose gets flattened, unless you're like, your nose is crushed. But it's kind of, I mean, prominent cheekbones and a flat nose, that sounds like a non-white person. And at one point when he was at the final point when he was walking with Julia, what was it? She crushed a twig under her feet, and there was some dirty, he says there were some dirty, some type of flowers that were like blowing by, and he said they were dirty flowers. I forget what type of flowers they were, and she crushed a twig under her feet. The twig is brown, and there's just all these connections between like white being above black, or white people being above black people, but like in the language, like you were talking about the language, which is also quite interesting. I never heard about that speech of MLK's. But yeah, that's when I was talking. Oh, Gus, what do you think about that with anagrams that I pointed out? Because you said to look for that.
Job well done. Job well done. I think the prominence of Jen, particularly, I think they pointed out earlier in the book that everything was rationed. They didn't have plentiful resources, things that they needed, razor blades, chocolate, but they had plentiful gin. And then when it gets to the end, when he's been broken, maybe even niggerized, he has gin-scented tears. I've never known of alcohol to be so pungent as to where your tears are now gin-scented. But, yeah, I think that's could be on to something, definitely. I think you were talking about the style. I think the style is an integral aspect of the content of the book. This is what I mean in terms of white people. There's an extraordinary gap in the skill that the most powerful white people, their skill with language, and the skill that non-white people have with language. I mean, it is immense. They know words are an extraordinarily powerful weapon. You can use words, and I mean, just the fact that he spends so much time at the end of the book, really, that's the conclusion of the book, is the last thing you should be thinking about is these words, the terms, the appendix, where he breaks down the implications of these words. And I just think that kind of goes back to what you said about you're slacking. I think the whole non-white collective is, quote-unquote, slacking, is behind, has a deficit without understanding and use of language and how you can control the way people think, speak, and act just with the words that are used, verbally, written, just has an immense impact. So, yeah, I think that's there are probably a lot of others in terms of anagrams and just being able to move terms around, move letters around. Even I was looking at Newspeak, what B. Moore touched on. I think that's related, both of y'all, what she touched on. When she was saying Newspeak, I was saying, oh, wow, the homophones, again, because you could add a K, right, so it would be K-N-E-W, and then with peak, there's a P-E-A-K, and then there's a P-E-E-K. So you could change both of those words around and have the same thing, and it would just send your mind in some different directions. Newspeak, if you had N-E-W-S, and then P-E-E-K, a peek is in to take a quick look at something. You're not getting a full glance. You're not getting a long look, just a quick brief glimpse. I suspect that sort of thing is going on right now, where you get a glimpse, a quick shot, where somebody is telling you, oh, this is the news, and you're only getting a 5-second snippet with no context, and they're saying, oh, you got the news, this is it, and you have an understanding of what's going on, and that's not true at all. And I think that's exactly what he's just described, with the whole concept of the way he's using language in this book to control people. So, yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, I just want to just throw in what I said about rats versus star and Jen versus Nig. They're also palindromes besides being anagrams. So just want to throw that out there.
Can I be heard?
Yes, sir.
Okay. One thing I'd like to mention is that egalitarian, the word egalitarian was not used in the book, although politarian and totalitarian was used. So any belief in equality was not even considered in this particular book, but the book suggests that through a series of programming, through the media, in images and written words, and treatments, whether it's benefits or oppressions, each individual could indeed be altered, or, like Julia mentioned, that they couldn't get inside you, but in the end, you could tell they could get inside you. And if you look at that from the system of white supremacy, I think we all need to, I know myself, I am looking inside of myself to see how much deprogramming I can do within myself. I know that I've been affected by this system in which we live in, and so I'm making a conscious effort to debrief myself. So, and if the individuals, if the thoughts of the individuals can be controlled, then the entire person can be controlled. I thought it was interesting about the Newspeak. They didn't mention too much about Old Speak. Old Speak then was just a standard English that's used now. So, Newspeak, and which brings up a point that if we want to establish justice, then one of the things that we should include in would be a form of Newspeak. We would have to somewhat change the language to rid those words that have those double meanings and that deliberately portray black or dark as menacing and evil. And also the concept of double think, I think in some ways remind us of eroding, where if there's one side, then there's always another side, so that there would be a sort of, if there's a good, then an evil, so that, there would be that form of confusion. And one thing about Winston I'd like to say is that in the end, the mind control worked to a certain point, but he never stopped dreaming. He was dreaming even in the end, and his memory was still there, because towards the end, he remembered some parts of his childhood where he himself, his sister, and his mother were playing that game, and I thought it was interesting that the book mentioned that the telescreen was solid for a moment. So I'll mute my line on that.
Great points about the use of language, and I think that is the caller in the Bronx, where he was saying the style and words and language, how that's such a key aspect of the book. And I would say George Orwell on the whole, I think the bulk of his body of work incorporates that. Sometimes, and I think this is the most explicit manner in his work that touches on how important and powerful words are, and how they, really words, in many ways, in my opinion, words and language, the use of words and symbols ends up being a principal aspect of how people function, how they think, how they speak, how they behave. In that appendix where he talked about how some behaviors ceased entirely because you didn't have words to describe those behaviors anymore. So people weren't thinking about doing those things because they didn't have the words to describe those behaviors. That is enormous. I think that's huge. I think that is deliberate, and I think that is accurate with regards to really understanding just when she talks about certain aspects of culture, the aspects that you don't think about exert the most influence over your thinking. Language, I think that's something that just becomes something that we're totally oblivious about. Even little things, the word fair. People that listen to the program, and I've said, it's not, again, that I don't like the term, it's that I understand how that term supports the system of white supremacy. And people who've been listening to this program for years, and they still use the term fair. It was used on the program the other day a couple times. Just not monitoring the words that we use to articulate our ideas, our frustrations, our suggestions on how to replace white supremacy with justice is enormous, because I think white people, they spend a ton of time crafting, molding words that will best serve their racist agenda. Believe that worldwide. In fact, I'll mute my line, but I'll get this in. And I thought of this a while ago. White people, they have many words for lie, the verb form to tell a lie, right? I lied, he lied, we're lying. They have many different verb forms of words that capture lying, even fudge. I fudged, right? Welsing moment, chocolate and lying. There is no, unless I'm incorrect, and please set me straight if I am, but I don't even think they have a verb form of a word to tell the truth. They don't have a verb form of a word. It would have to be a phrase. The way they were saying, you would have to break Newspeak and go back to something to try to say, well, I told the truth. They don't have a verb that captures that. That right there tells you a lot about white people, unless I'm incorrect. I'll mute my line there.
Let me just throw out too. I just got the book "Sexual Sabotage" by Judith Reisman, who was on the cows and dropped a bombshell on me, made me have to rethink some things that I was into, Jesus, what was I say? 1948 was the year that this guy Alfred Kinsey came out with this so-called study, which dynamically changed the so-called country that we live in as far as the sexual politics. Like, it really that was 1948. if anyone knows about that. I found that really interesting.
I just wanted to go back to that Dr. Martin Luther King speech. I feel like it's really proper. So to the box caller, I think you should check it out. I do believe there's a sound clip on YouTube.
What's that one called again?
I just know it as I want to get the language right. So I'm almost certain if you type that in, I want to get the language right, that it'll show up.
All right, thank you very much for that.
My pleasure.
We have about 10 minutes left in the program with that anti-sexual, so-called homosexual behavior, just the creation of those terms. I've had dialogue with non-white people who told me that just when they were young, like younger than 15, younger than 14, just that word entering their vocabulary influenced their behavior in an incorrect manner. Just the term homosexual. Words have an enormous impact. They can send your mind in totally different directions. Consciously, subconsciously, huge impact worldwide. Something else that stood out when it got to, I guess, the end of the story with Winston and Julia and all, when it gets to the end and Winston is tearing up and it seems like the party is doing well, they've conquered Africa and all that, and he says that he loves Big Brother. And I thought, wow. And he had even, I think, said a couple sentences, paragraph or two before that, he had said that the bullet entered his brain. And I think he was speaking in a metaphorical sense in terms of he had a change in his worldview, a change in the way that he thought about Big Brother, the party. And I think white people do the same thing with victims of racism. That scene right there with Winston, it reminded me, I'm not going to call names, but some of the non-white people who have been praising Django Unchained and talking about what a wonderful effort they thought it was. And I've heard some non-white people, they said they saw it a bunch of times and it freed something in them. It reminded me of that level of success. When you're being oppressed, when you're being subjugated, and you can get that person to a point where you've broken them and they don't want to attack you, they don't want to oppose you, they praise you. They don't see you as what you're doing as incorrect. They want to agree with you. They want to identify with you. Just total submission. Stockholm Syndrome, all of that. When your thinking as it relates to white people has totally switched, I don't see them as enemy. I think that is the goal in the system of white supremacy, where they have that white identification. You do not see us as someone that you should be opposing. You do not see us as enemies. You don't see white people as enemies. You don't see them as being individuals who are at war with you in all areas of people activity. You want to be liked by them. You do like them. You want to be close to them. You want to be associated with them, loved by them, accepted by them. That is the goal. And as I think B. Moore was saying, silent weapons for quiet wars, white people excel at that and all other forms of warfare, at least to this point. I'll mute my line. We have about a little less than 10 minutes. Folks have anything they want to get in before we wrap up?
Earlier in the book, also, like right at the beginning, this round where I was saying there was something about sense that he was kind of like really trying to hammer into, talking about like smells or whatever. it also kind of seemed to me like it was I mean, the whole book is super technical. You know, it's all very meticulously kind of illustrated, you know, with the words. But it just seemed to me like he was looking at it like a scientist looking at a computer chip. Like, it just seemed like the components of the machine, you know, are the people, and just like the individual people as being, you know, again with the Urugu reference, but just the despiritualized object. You know, it becomes despiritualized world becomes objectified, and just this very, you know, we all kind of serve as just machines within a machine in the wider context. It's just a big old machine, and we're all acting mechanically as parts of the machine. That was a theme that stuck out to me, very mechanical.
I thought the part in the book where O'Brien said that Julia had betrayed him, it took no time for her to betray him. I think that was a tactic that he was using, maybe on her also, telling her that Winston had betrayed her. And it looked as though Julia may have held out even longer than Winston, because Winston had given up even before he had went into room 101. He had submitted. The word capitulate, you know, he had already surrendered. And I may be stretching it a bit, but the long scar that was partially hidden by her hair may have indicated that she had been given a frontal lobotomy. She was no longer herself, and that particular part of the brain would affect personality and all of those things that he was alluding to that had changed about her. She was a tactical person at first, very organized, and later on, none of those characteristics were apparent.
I remember our earlier dialogue where I was saying, not sure. I was saying there's no consensus whether or not Julia is a spy or not. Well, I guess she did admit that she was in the Junior Spy League, or whether or not she was functioning as a spy in relation to the contact that she had with Winston in the book. She had a lobotomy. That's why I said no consensus. There are a good number of people who read this, and they do not think she was functioning as a spy or that she was working with the thought police in any way. She was just another victim. They got her at the end as well. Just since this is our last section on the book, again, I think I said repeatedly, do not wait till the end. We had one person that called in from a block number. Your line should be open. If you had something quick, concise, you wanted to get it in. We only have a couple minutes left in the broadcast.
Oh, Gus, it's B-more. My line hung up, and then, I don't know, I called back in. It shouldn't be blocked, though.
Oh, it was. I got you. It was somebody else.
Oh, okay. I was just going to touch on the whole rats in the cage thing again. I was concurring with what you said. I was just going to say the whole rats in the cage phenomenon. It's like, you know, another rat, another trapped or imprisoned person can't really do anything for you. But the one who cages you controls and has the power to feed you or not, give you water or not, etc. So it's like, let me gain the love, trust, and adoration of massa so that I can, you know, keep my life in this cage okay, or make my life in this cage okay. He'll keep my cage clean. Even though I'm not free, even though I'm caged up, let me gain the trust of Massa, or the love of Massa, so that I can at least make it okay.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that maybe one of the next books we can read would be The Racketeer by John Grisham. It's about a black lawyer that's unjustly sent to prison for a crime he didn't commit. I mean, I just finished reading it, and I think it's real constructive, and I think everybody on the panel would really like it. Just a thought. I'm just throwing it out there.
John Grisham, The Racketeer.
Yeah, it's his newest one. Just came out a few months ago.
Right on. That will be added to our list. For next week, I'm enjoying, I think, the style, like we vote on a book and pick one, and then I'll pick one, like rotating that way. The group voted for 1984. The book that I wanted to do before we got to 1984 was Melba Patillo Beals, Black female, Warriors Don't Cry. She kept a running journal of her first year. She was amongst the Little Rock Nine that were the first black students that, quote-unquote, integrated Little Rock Central High School. She kept a diary of that whole year, and I thought it would be very constructive to hear all of the heinous things that white people did to her and the other students that first year. But I actually wanted to do that before 1984, but all worked out. So I'm thinking we'll probably do that next. So once that's done, I already have a submission for the book after that, John Grisham, Racketeer. This will give people time to get the book. If they want to snag a copy, audio book, or if you want to get a hard copy, you'll have due time. I hadn't even heard of that one. So, yeah, we'll definitely put that on tap. One of our next books, folks can vote, see what they want to, see which book they want to do after Warriors Don't Cry. But that should be our next book. I even had to juggle a bit on that because Dr. Rasayan, he told me about a book. It's called The Wisdom of Psychopaths. I hadn't heard of this book either, but a white man in the UK wrote this book, and Dr. Rasayan, he was saying that this just further evidences the pathology of white people. He was saying that it's a fascinating book. I got the hard copy, and I think I made a comment. I just said kind of loosely, it would be cool to have the audio book, and one of the listeners tracked it down, downloaded it, got it for me. So I have the audio book, the unabridged audio book of that as well. So that could also be an option. Even if we don't do the book study on that, I would recommend folks check that out, The Wisdom of Psychopaths. Fascinating text. I think the first sentence of the book is, my father was a psychopath. I think that's the first sentence and how the book starts off. White people, man, white people. Fascinating session. I hope the study sessions on 1984 were of some value to folks who tuned in. I think language, super important. We talk about that all the time. Mr. Fuller, his word guide. I think, at least in my opinion, quite a bit of constructive material. We'll be back on Saturday, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific for the compensatory call-in. Anybody have any final sentence they wanted to get in before we conclude?
Yeah, I just want to say concerning rock books, there's also one called Hazel and Elizabeth. I don't know if you've heard of that one. That particular picture, that photo that was shown all over the world from 1957, I think it was, and they show that one black girl walking in the school, and she's wearing the dark sunglasses, and the white girl is screaming at her. And that was, that picture went, it was real popular all over the world. Well, anyway, they have a book out too, and it's about those two women, or I should say females, and how they became friends later on, and then they fell out, afterwards and stuff. It's a really, really good book. It's called Hazel and Elizabeth. I just, want to tell you, it's about that whole Little Rock, episode 2.
Wonderful. Hazel and Elizabeth.
Yeah.
I will Google that up once the program concludes. You could share with children. I think we talked about that consistently. Material that you can share with your offspring that deals with racism, white supremacy. I think Warriors Don't. I haven't listened to the whole book as of yet, but I think Warriors Don't Cry. This book I just heard of, but these are books I think, particularly if you have children that are over 10, you could probably share this material with them, and it would probably have a lot of relevance, because I suspect if they're black and they're in the racist school system anywhere in the world, what these black people experienced 50, 60 years ago, they will probably be able to relate to quite a bit of it, unfortunately. Okay. But this is material you can be sharing with your children. If they're 14, 15 years old, even younger than that, I suspect. If they're 13, they could probably read Warriors Don't Cry. It's not like Urugu. It's not super difficult reading. I think they would probably get some maybe. I suspect they could get some enjoyment out of it. And you can get the audio book if they're not into the text reading. Excellent suggestion. The one you said about the psycho, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The one you said the psychotic, what's the name of that one? Wisdom of Psychopaths.
Oh, okay.
I can give you the author's name. I put he has a website. The author's name is Kevin Dutton. Then dominate. UTTON. Kevin Dutton, The Wisdom of Psychopaths. Oh. And he has a website, hold on. You should be able to download the book easily. I found it in like 5 minutes. I think I put that link on Facebook too. I know I put it in the Cows group. I think I put it on my page too. But you should be able to download the textbook or the audio book, either one.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Hey, can I throw in one last thing?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. I like the gentleman, the previous caller's point about he was saying that we have to develop our own, so-called Newspeak, to combat the anti-blackness in, the Latin languages, and what that sparked in my head, my brain computer, like I've been kind of thinking about this theme of like I'm kind of an artist and like I'm kind of scientific too, so it's like black. The way I see it, blackness is something that you can't see. So you're not, when you say black, you're not actually talking about a thing. You're talking about something that is beyond what you can see. So I'm thinking maybe black is actually just the depth. Blackness is something that is beyond what you can see. And I'm thinking like of a well. Like a well is when you look down a well and you see blackness, the well isn't blackness, the well is the well, So, and then I was thinking about Francis Welsing, and like the well, I think maybe like the word well, means, in a good condition. And something to stick in your hat and ponder. I like the word well. I think it makes more sense than black to describe what we are as the depth that we represent. And the well does sing through Francis Welsing. So, yeah, thanks for letting me share that.
Right on. We should be back tomorrow. Compensatory call-in, 9 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Pacific. Tune in. We'll catch up on news reports and hopefully have constructive dialogue, racism, white supremacy, and what can be done to replace white supremacy with justice immediately. I hope the broadcast has been of constructive value. And thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Hope you got something constructive out of Mr. Orwell, 1984. And thanks for the book suggestions as well. I've written them down, so I'll be sure to share those. We're voting for the next book. I'll make sure those are some of the top ones that are included, so we can take our votes, make our selections on what we want to read next. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Replace white supremacy with justice as soon as possible. Creator, we ask, please aid us in gaining overstanding of the importance of words. Please help us to grasp how the very words that we take for granted and use on a daily basis mold the way we think, speak, and act. It has been time. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. Context of White Supremacy, signing out. Thank you all.
I am so proud of Negroes who are proud of being Negroes. They are what God made them.